In the stillness of night, when the world outside lies wrapped in a hushed silence, imagine unrolling a map so old that the edges crumble at your fingertips. The parchment smells faintly of dust and forgotten journeys, its surface softened by centuries of hands that once traced its lines. By the light of a single flickering candle, you lean closer and notice a word etched across the breadth of northern Asia, a word that seems both familiar and foreign: Tartaria. It stretches across an expanse so vast that it swallows Siberia, Central Asia, even reaching into parts of Europe. And yet, when you close the map and turn to the history books you grew up with, that name is gone. It is as though the land itself dissolved into mist, leaving behind only a whisper carried in fading ink. How can something so large, so proudly inscribed across the maps of the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, simply vanish from our collective memory? Was it merely a cartographer's mistake, a careless exaggeration of lands unknown? Or was there more, something deliberate, something hidden, something erased? Close your eyes and imagine snow falling over endless plains, muffling every sound until the earth itself seems to sleep. Out of the white expanse, faint shapes emerge, domes and towers rising like mirages, their rooftops catching the cold winter sun. You almost hear the echo of hooves, the cry of a hawk wheeling overhead, and the deep resonance of voices speaking a language now silenced. For a moment, it feels as though you are brushing against the veil of a forgotten world, one that was not meant to be remembered. Legends speak of Tartars, warriors of the steppe, their banners streaming against the wind. Travelers' accounts hint at magnificent cities and palaces, adorned with arches and spires that rivaled the grandeur of Europe. And yet these voices are faint, scattered, often dismissed as confusion or myth. Could it be that the story of Tartaria was never meant to be told in full? Could it be that an entire empire was folded out of sight, tucked beneath the pages of history like a secret too dangerous to share? Imagine for a moment what it means for a civilization to be erased, not conquered, not defeated, but scrubbed from memory, as though a hand reached down through time and drew a line through its name. What remains? A few scattered ruins, symbols carved into stone, maps that contradict the silence of textbooks, and the quiet suspicion that history, as we know it, is not a perfect mirror of truth, but a story shaped by those who hold the pen. There is something haunting in the idea of absence, of a past that once was, but now lies hidden in shadows. Tartaria is not merely a place on a map, it is a riddle left for us to ponder. Did it exist as a great empire spanning thousands of miles? Was it a loose collection of tribes, misunderstood by Western cartographers? Or was it something stranger still, a civilization with knowledge and power so unsettling that later generations sought to bury it beneath layers of rewritten history? The candle burns lower, the edges of the old map curl inward like a secret reluctant to be told, and as the night deepens, you cannot help but feel that the silence surrounding Tartaria is not accidental, it is purposeful, heavy, almost deliberate, like the silence that follows when a roomful of people agree never to speak of something again. Perhaps Tartaria is less a place than a question that lingers in the folds of forgotten atlases, in the buried windows of half submerged buildings, in the whispered stories of ancestors who remembered what the books would not. To follow this thread is to step into a labyrinth of mysteries, of mud floods and vanished cities, of technologies hidden in plain sight, of an empire that may have been greater than we dare imagine. So let us begin not with an answer, but with a whisper of snow, of stone, of ink on a fragile page, a whisper that says, what if the erasure of Tartaria was the greatest cover up of all time? And as the last echo of that thought settles in the night, the journey beckons you deeper into maps, into ruins, into the veiled corridors of forgotten history, where the silence of Tartaria still waits to be broken. And from here, we step gently into the realm of maps that still carry its name, as if reluctant to surrender the memory completely. There are moments when paper feels alive, as though it breathes with the memories of the centuries it has survived. In a dim archive, beneath shelves heavy with atlases bound in leather, you might stumble upon one of these fragile survivors. The map is brittle, its ink browned by time, but the letters still speak. And there it is again, stretching wide across the top of Asia, Tartaria.
The name sprawls with a quiet confidence, not a village, not a province, but an empire colored in broad strokes that dwarf entire nations. 16th century maps show at first a vast realm covering Siberia, Mongolia, Central Asia, even curling toward the Caspian and Black Seas. Sometimes the spelling shifts Tartary, Tartaria, Grande Tartary, but the meaning is unmistakable. This was a land known, or at least believed in, by explorers, merchants, and the mapmakers of Europe. The strangeness begins when you compare it to what you were taught. Today, we speak of Russia, Mongolia, Kazakhstan, and 100 smaller nations. Tartaria is not among them. Its presence on old maps feels like a ghost that should not be there, a phantom kingdom that refuses to die, even though the textbooks declare it never truly lived.
Take the Atlas of Abraham Ortelius, published in the late 1500s, one of the first modern cartographers of Europe. Within his ornate frames, you see the world as Renaissance eyes imagined it, oceans teeming with mythical sea creatures, winds personified as puffing faces at the map's edges, and across the vastness of Asia, his careful hand wrote Tartaria. To him, it was not a rumor, but a geographical certainty.
Later maps, like those of Guillaume de Lille in the 18th century, continue the tradition. In his elegantly drawn projections, Tartaria spreads east of Muscovy, pressing up against the frozen seas of the north and stretching down toward China. Some editions even divided it into Great Tartary, Little Tartary, Chinese Tartary, as if cartographers were trying to impose order on something they sensed but could not fully grasp. Imagine running your hand across these ancient surfaces. The inked lines trace rivers that twist like veins across the page, mountains shaded with delicate strokes, forests hinted at by tiny tree symbols, and amidst them the name of Tartaria lingers, as though written with a kind of certainty that later history no longer permits.
Why? That is the question that lingers like incense smoke in a closed room. Why would generations of mapmakers agree on its existence, only for the world to later dismiss it as error or exaggeration? Was it a convenient placeholder for lands unexplored, the way blank spaces once bore the warning, "Here be dragons"? Or was there something real, cities, palaces, peoples, whose memory was gradually overwritten as empires rose and borders shifted? There is a haunting beauty to maps. They do not just describe geography, they reveal how people once imagined the shape of their world. In the 16th century, the world was expanding, explorers pushing into the Americas, Africa, and Asia. To fill the unknown, cartographers blended rumor with report, hearsay with hope, and yet Tartaria was more than rumor. It appeared consistently for centuries across dozens of respected atlases. It was not drawn as fantasy, but as fact.
Somewhere in the candlelit quiet of those map makers' studios, quills scratched across parchment, while merchants whispered of distant caravans, of horsemen riding the steppes, of golden domes arising over icy rivers. The information was imperfect, but it was enough to persuade the cartographers that an empire stretched across half of Asia, and so they inscribed its name with steady hands, never imagining that centuries later it would be erased as if it had never been.
Pause here and consider the weight of erasure. To erase is not merely to forget, it is to remove, to deny, to close the door upon a memory and insist it never opened in the first place. If Tartaria was nothing but a vague label for unknown lands, why would later historians feel the need to deny it so firmly? Why not simply let it remain a curiosity of old maps, a relic of half knowledge, like sea serpents and lost continents? Why does the absence feel so deliberate? Imagine walking through a gallery of maps, each one from a different century. You begin at the Renaissance, where Tartaria spreads wide, a kingdom in ink and imagination. You move to the 17th century, and it is still there, subdivided into regions carefully named. By the 18th century, it appears refined, its borders drawn more carefully, its divisions more specific. But then something strange happens. In the 19th century, Tartaria shrinks. It fractures, names like Siberia and Central Asia replace it, and by the time you reach the 20th century, the word has vanished completely. It is as though you were watching a great land dissolve before your eyes, not in battle, not in conquest, but in silence, a silence louder than war drums, more final than defeat, a silence crafted by the steady hand of revision. The historian will say, it was never an empire, merely a name Europeans gave to lands they did not yet understand. But when you hold those old maps, you cannot shake the feeling that something greater lingers beneath the ink. Names matter, they carry weight, they shape memory, they define identity. To remove a name is to sever its story. To blot out Tartaria is to consign it to a twilight realm, half remembered, half denied. Listen closely, and you may almost hear the maps themselves speaking. The rustle of paper becomes the whisper of wind across vast steppes. The faded ink becomes the shadow of towers, long since crumbled, and the silence of textbooks becomes the hollow space where a story should have been.
The maps remind us that history is not fixed. It shifts like sand in the wind, reshaped by the hands that draw it, the pens that inscribe it, the powers that decide what to keep and what to erase. And perhaps Tartaria lingers still, not as a nation, not as an empire, but as a question. Why would they hide this from us? The candle burns low again, shadows stretching across the archive walls. The map before you curls at its edges as if it wishes to close itself, to guard its secret a little longer, but you cannot look away from that word, standing bold against the centuries, Tartaria. And so, with the sound of paper folding softly in your hands, you step deeper into the mystery, not just of the name, but of the people who once carried it. For a land without inhabitants is only a blank on a page. Who were the Tartars, and why has their story been scattered like dust across the steppes? The journey continues then into the lives of those who bore the name, the people behind the phantom empire whose echoes still drift across the winds of forgotten Asia. Step softly now into the imagined silence of a vast plain. The horizon seems endless, unbroken by walls or towers, only the sweep of grasses bowing in the wind, their heads shimmering like a golden sea. Far away, you hear the faintest rhythm, hooves beating against the earth, not hurried but steady like a drum echoing across time. These are the echoes of the people once called the Tartars. The name itself is elusive, shifting as languages collide. In Europe, they were the Tartars or Tatars, a word that carried both mystery and menace. Some whispered it with dread, remembering invasions that swept westward like storms. Others used it more loosely as a blanket term for countless tribes and nations who roamed the steppes. To the Russians, they were neighbors and adversaries. To the Chinese dynasties, they were shadows at the border, sometimes foes, sometimes allies. But to themselves, what did they call their own world? That is harder to know. Their voices, preserved only in fragments, reach us like echoes down a long corridor, fading before we can grasp their full shape.
Picture them as chroniclers once described, horsemen born of the steppe, their lives woven into the rhythm of the herds they tended and the skies they followed. They were said to ride with ease from childhood, their small frames carried by ponies, hardened by endless journeys. The wind was their companion, the open horizon their dwelling. In winter, they wrapped themselves in furs that smelled of smoke and snow. In summer, they dressed in lighter robes dyed with natural pigments drawn from earth and plant.
But alongside this pastoral life, there were whispers of grandeur, accounts from travelers, often unsure of what they saw, described cities rising unexpectedly from the emptiness, fortified towns with high walls, golden domes gleaming under northern suns, marketplaces where silks and spices passed hands. Could these have been the true centers of Tartaria, later forgotten, absorbed into empires that claimed them as their own? The records left by outsiders often blur into myth. Marco Polo, centuries earlier, spoke of grand khans, palaces, and riches drawn from across Asia. Later, 17th century merchants carried tales of massive encampments, banners embroidered with symbols of the sun and moon, and rituals performed under open skies. Some claim the Tartars were fierce warriors, tall and formidable, whose very presence spread fear. Others painted them as noble, even gentle, living in harmony with the cycles of nature, which was true, perhaps both, for a people can be many things at once depending on who gazes upon them.
Close your eyes and imagine sitting by a fire in the middle of the plain. The wood crackles, sending sparks upward into the night. Around you, men and women sing in a language whose tones rise and fall like the wind. Their voices weave together in chants, telling stories of ancestors, of spirits who rode the skies, of battles fought long ago. A child curls against its mother's side, lulled by the rhythm of song and flame. The smell of roasted meat drifts through the air, mingling with the sharpness of smoke. For a moment, the world is whole, balanced between earth and sky. If Tartaria was truly an empire, it was not one built like Rome, of marble and laws, nor like China, with its bureaucracies and walls. It may have been an empire of movement, fluid as the rivers, wide as the horizon, an empire measured not by stone, but by space, by the reach of its riders, by the unity of its clans, by the symbols they shared. That is why maps could stretch its borders so far, because to those outside, its breadth was immeasurable, its edges dissolving into distance.
Yet there are clues of permanence too. In Siberia, in Central Asia, in forgotten corners of Russia, there are ruins whose origins are uncertain, towers with foundations too deep to be mere watchposts, buildings with windows as now buried beneath the earth, their lower levels swallowed by time, as though the ground itself rose to conceal them. Were these the cities of Tartaria, or were they claimed by others, rewritten into the histories of later nations?
Even the people themselves became shadows. As Russia expanded eastward, as China consolidated its frontiers, as Central Asia fractured into khanate and later into colonial provinces, the name Tartar dissolved. Some groups were absorbed, others renamed, others dismissed as tribes without a nation. But could it be that this dissolution was more than the natural tide of empire? Could it be that someone wished their collective identity to vanish, to be remembered only as scattered fragments rather than a whole? Think of how memory fades. A name once used with reverence becomes a slur spoken by enemies. A people once feared for their strength are remembered only as raiders, dismissed as nomads. Their achievements, their crafts, their knowledge, their symbols are folded into the stories of others. And when the maps themselves begin to change, erasing their name from the page, the silence grows complete.
Yet silence can be deceiving. In the music of Central Asia, in the ornaments of Siberian tribes, in the ceremonies of Kazakh and Tuvan shamans, faint threads remain, motifs of suns and moons, double headed eagles, intricate weavings of horse and sky. They whisper of a time when the steppe was not a void, but a center, not the edge of the world, but the heart of one. The word Tartar itself became a kind of labyrinth. For Europeans, it conjured images of Mongol invasions, of Genghis Khan and his descendants sweeping westward. To Russians, it meant the Turkic peoples at their borders, some conquered, some allied. To travelers, it became a convenient label for anyone whose face or language did not match their expectations. But what if beneath this confusion lay a single thread? What if Tartaria was not just a vague term, but a true identity, obscured beneath centuries of mistranslation and denial?
Imagine again those riders on the steppe, their horses stirring clouds of dust, their banners lifting in the wind. Behind them, in the distance, a city waits, its walls pale against the setting sun, its towers rising above the grasslands. We may never know its true name, yet it flickers in the mind's eye like a mirage, refusing to vanish. Perhaps this is why the mystery endures, because even in absence, the Tartars feel present. They ride through the corridors of forgotten memory, their shadows cast upon old maps, their songs woven into the wind, and though history has tried to silence them, their story resists, seeping back through cracks in the wall of time. Who were the Tartars? Warriors, nomads, traders, shamans, perhaps even builders of cities now hidden under soil. They were many things, as all peoples are, but above all, they were there. They lived, they breathed, they left traces too wide to be dismissed as mere error. To deny them completely is to deny the maps, the travelers, the ruins, the symbols, and perhaps even the memory etched in the land itself.
And so the question remains, shimmering like heat on the horizon. If these people were real, if Tartaria was once an empire or a great civilization, why would history work so hard to erase them? The answer may lie not in the people themselves, but in the earth beneath their feet. For the cities said to belong to Tartaria carry scars of a strange fate: windows buried in mud, staircases leading into soil, foundations swallowed by sudden catastrophe.
And so our journey moves onward from the riders of the steppe to the cities that no longer rise above it, the strange, half buried architecture that suggests a catastrophe not only of stone, but of memory itself. The earth has a way of keeping secrets. It swallows layer upon layer, until the traces of what once stood proud lie hidden just beneath the soles of our feet. Walk through the grand squares of old St. Petersburg or the older quarters of Kazan, and you may notice something peculiar. Look closely at the windows of the buildings. Some are half buried, their frames resting at ground level or even lower, their glass panes peering into the soil like eyes smothered in sleep.
This is no accident of architecture. Who, after all, builds windows into the earth, doors that open into mud? And yet, such features appear again and again, not only in Russia, but in cities across Europe, in parts of Asia, even in the Americas. The pattern is whispers of something strange, that once these structures stood taller, their lower levels opened to the air, only to be swallowed by a sudden deluge of earth. It is here that whispers of Tartaria entwine with another legend, the great mud floods. Imagine a city bustling with life. Horses clip clop over cobblestones, vendors call from their stalls, church bells peal into the afternoon sky. The facades of buildings gleam with ornate plasterwork, high windows flooding rooms with sunlight. Then, without warning, the sky darkens. Perhaps heavy rains fall for days without end, or perhaps something stranger occurs. The ground itself shifts, mud surging like a slow avalanche, creeping upward until the lowest floors vanish.
When the waters recede, the streets are changed. Where once there were grand entrances, there are now half buried archways. Where once the first floor opened onto the street, it has become a basement. And the people, bewildered but resilient, carry on, building stairways upward, sealing the buried doors, pretending, perhaps, that this is how it was always meant to be. Across the old world, such anomalies still stand in plain sight. Walk the boulevards of St. Petersburg, that glittering jewel of Russia built in a rush of ambition by Peter the Great, and you may find windows sunken beneath the streets, doors that seem to lead nowhere. Descend into older quarters of Moscow, and there too are buildings whose foundations vanish into earth. In Kazan, in Novgorod, in cities farther east, similar patterns emerge.
Skeptics explain these away with the neatness of architectural theory. The ground was raised, they say, to improve drainage, or the streets were rebuilt at higher levels, burying the old. Yet the scale of it all nags at the imagination. Can so many cities across continents all have suffered the same fate? And why do these buried facades often appear in structures whose age is uncertain, their origins clouded in contradiction?
The mystery deepens when we leave the great capitals and turn to towns less touched by imperial renovation. In small villages, forgotten fortresses, even in abandoned monasteries, we find the same signs: doors leading into earth, windows peering into nothingness. The soil seems to have risen like a tide, swallowing the old world and leaving the new perched just above it.
And here, some whisper, is where Tartaria lies hidden, not in the textbooks, but beneath our feet. What if the cities we call Russian or European or Asian once belonged to a civilization far older, their grandeur inherited rather than built anew? The empire of Tartaria, so boldly drawn on maps, may have left its bones in these buried structures only for later powers to claim them, to rewrite their origins, to say, we built this, when in truth they inherited ruins half swallowed by the earth. Close your eyes and picture such a city in its prime: white stone gleaming in sunlight, copper domes catching fire at dusk, streets laid with symmetry and care. Towers rise not just as fortifications, but as resonant instruments, their shapes designed to capture and amplify the music of the air. In the courtyards, fountains sparkle, their waters flowing in channels that hum with hidden purpose. To live here is to live within harmony, a geometry of sound, light, and stone.
Now imagine that same city half buried, its lower halls dark and damp, stairways leading down into silence. Candles flicker where once sunlight streamed. Mold creeps across carved lintels, and in time, new inhabitants arrive, uncertain of who built what, content to use what remains. They give new names to old walls, new coats of paint to ancient facades. History bends to their convenience, and the original builders fade into myth. Could this be why Tartaria vanished? Not because it never existed, but because its remains were too obvious, too grand, too impossible to reconcile with the narratives of rising empires. Easier then to call them Russian, or Ottoman, or Byzantine. Easier to bury the very idea of a lost empire beneath the mud, both literal and historical. The mud flood theory may sound fantastic, yet its imagery lingers. Whole cities drowned not by water, but by earth itself. And across continents, the evidence remains etched in stone and soil. To walk these streets is to walk upon layers of time, one civilization piled atop another, the older one silenced, the newer one triumphant.
Even in the Americas, explorers have found buildings with similar traits, lower levels sunken, windows half buried. Could the phenomenon have been global? Could a single catastrophe or a series of them have reshaped the world in ways we have forgotten? And if so, was Tartaria one of the civilizations lost in that upheaval, its memory washed away like mud in a flood? There is a haunting symmetry to the idea. A vast empire remembered on maps but erased from history, its cities still standing but claimed by others, its name blotted out but its bones surviving in stone and brick. To acknowledge this would be to rewrite the narrative of the modern age. Better perhaps for those in power to remain silent, to let the mud cover not only the buildings but the truth itself.
The buried cities speak without words. They tell their stories in half sunken archways, in doors that open into soil, in staircases that descend into darkness. They remind us that history is not as clean as we are told, that the ground beneath us is layered with forgotten lives. And perhaps if we listen closely, they also remind us of Tartaria, a name too vast to vanish completely, a whisper that still drifts beneath the dust.
The question that rises, like the buried windows themselves, is simple yet profound. Were these ruins the inheritance of forgotten Tartars? And if so, what else might they have left behind, not only in stone, but in knowledge, in technology, in mysteries yet to be uncovered? For in the heart of these half buried cities lies another puzzle, their architecture. Towers shaped like resonant instruments, domes that seem designed for more than beauty, structures whose very geometry hums with hidden meaning. Could it be that the builders of Tartaria possessed technologies we have yet to rediscover? Could the mud flood have not only buried their cities, but also their secrets? And so, as we linger in these strange, half swallowed streets, our journey leads us naturally onward into the question of technology itself and the possibility that Tartaria once held knowledge of energies now lost to us, waiting quietly in the silent shapes of stone and sky. There are buildings that seem less like shelters than instruments. Their forms are too precise, their curves too deliberate, their proportions so harmonious that one cannot help but wonder whether they were designed to do more than simply house people. Walk into an old cathedral or mosque, or stand beneath the domes of ancient halls, and you may feel it, a subtle vibration in the air, a resonance that hums not in your ears but deep in your chest. It is as though stone itself is singing. For those who search the shadows of Tartaria, this is no coincidence. They whisper that these grand structures, the ornate cathedrals of St. Petersburg, the vast halls scattered across Central Asia, even towers tucked into forgotten corners of Europe, were more than places of worship or symbols of power. They were machines disguised as architecture.
Picture the onion domes rising into the sky, their gleaming surfaces catching the sun. To the eye, they are beautiful. To the imagination, they are capacitors, resonant chambers designed to capture and distribute invisible currents. The spires, so delicate and vertical, resemble antennae. The patterns inscribed in tiles and carvings echo the very geometries of vibration. Spirals, stars, lattices that resemble waveforms. We today think of electricity as something born in the 19th century, coaxed from copper wires and spinning turbines. But what if there was another way? An older way of drawing energy from the air itself. Legends say that Nikola Tesla, centuries later, dreamt of such things, towers that could harness the natural frequencies of the earth and sky, distributing power freely to all. But perhaps Tesla was not inventing, perhaps he was remembering. Imagine a world where energy was not mined, not burned, not chained to engines belching smoke, but drawn from the very atmosphere, as natural and abundant as sunlight or wind. Imagine cities aglow with soft light, fountains flowing not from pumps, but from pressure, harnessed by resonance, warmth, drawn from the vibrations of the earth itself. Such a world would leave little trace in wires or engines, for its machines would be its very buildings, its power sources hidden in the shapes of domes and towers.
Stand in the nave of a great cathedral and clap your hands. The sound rebounds in waves, layering upon itself. turning a single moment into a cascade of echoes. The architects understood this, not just for the sake of beauty, but for something deeper. They were tuning space, shaping resonance. Could it be that they were tuning the very earth, drawing upon natural harmonics to amplify unseen forces?
Look again at the facades of so called imperial buildings, especially those in Russia built in sudden bursts of ambition. They appear too grand, too perfect for the short span of time historians assign them. St. Petersburg, for instance, rose in barely a century from swamp to city of marble, filled with palaces and churches of a scale that rivals Rome itself. How could such immensity be achieved so quickly with so little infrastructure to support it? Unless, of course, these were not built anew, but inherited, the remnants of Tartaria, claimed by new rulers, their functions forgotten, their technologies disguised as mere ornament.
The great mystery is not just how these buildings were made, but why they were made in the shapes they are. Why domes that seem to capture sound as well as light? Why spires like needles threading sky and earth? Why symmetry that reflects not only aesthetic beauty, but mathematical precision? There's a sense that these were not random choices, but deliberate designs meant to align with forces unseen.
Travelers in earlier centuries sometimes remarked on peculiar qualities in certain cities, the freshness of the air, the strange ease of voice carried across courtyards, the way light seemed to glow differently upon the stone. Were these mere impressions or faint memories of technologies we no longer recognize? If Tartaria once existed, perhaps it was less a kingdom of conquest and more a kingdom of harmony, a civilization that understood the deep resonances between matter and energy, between earth and sky.
Close your eyes and step into such a place. A tower hums softly as wind passes its open arches. Water flows in channels that seem alive, gurgling in patterns that soothe the ear. In a central square, a dome catches the noon sun, and beneath it, people gather not only to pray, but to feel, to recharge, to stand in the presence of something that connects them invisibly. No wires stretch across the landscape, no furnaces belch smoke into the sky. Yet the city thrives with quiet energy as though plugged directly into the pulse of the earth. Such imaginings may feel fanciful, yet traces remain. In old photographs, one sees spires bristling with metallic details. Since removed, in archives, one reads of lightning harvesters built into towers dismissed as primitive attempts at lightning rods, though their scale seems far greater than mere protection. In oral traditions, there are whispers of sound used for healing, of chants that resonated with the very walls, restoring balance to body and mind.
And then there are the anomalies. Buildings constructed in times when, according to official records, the technology to lift such massive stones or create such complex harmonics did not yet exist. Details that suggest knowledge out of time, inherited from an earlier age, knowledge that was later forgotten or concealed.
Why would such knowledge be erased? The answer may be as old as power itself. A world where energy is free, drawn from the air and earth, leaves little room for kings or empires to control it. To rule, one must ration. To profit, one must charge. To dominate, one must monopolize. What empire could tolerate a people who lived with power abundant and unchained? Easier then to bury their knowledge, to call their achievements mysteries of architecture, to fold their empire into silence? It is a haunting thought that the great smokestacks of industry, the endless hunger for coal and oil, may not have been inevitabilities of progress, but the consequence of forgetting, or the consequence of being made to forget, that beneath the soot and wires of modernity lies a quieter, cleaner path, one once walked by a people whose very buildings sang.
Even now, when you stand before the relics of that past, you may feel it, a faint hum beneath the soles of your feet, a whisper in the stone as the wind moves across arches, a sense of harmony in proportions that stir not just the eye, but the heart. These are the ghosts of Tartaria, not written in books, but carved into walls, waiting for those who still know how to listen. And so the question rises like a note held in the air. If such technologies once existed, and if Tartaria was the keeper of them, what became of that knowledge? Was it lost in catastrophe, buried in mud and silence, or was it seized, hidden, parceled out slowly to ensure that no people would again live free of the chains of scarcity? The buildings cannot answer. They only stand patient and silent, their domes still curving toward the heavens, their spires still piercing the sky. But if you pause beneath them, close your eyes, and let the hum of their geometry pass through you, perhaps you will hear the echo of what was lost. And from here, our path bends naturally toward the catastrophe itself, the mud floods that seem to have buried not only buildings, but the very memory of a civilization that might once have sung with the energies of the earth. The earth is not always gentle. It shifts, it breathes, it swells with unseen forces, and at times it seems to rise against the works of humankind. There is an unsettling pattern that emerges when one looks carefully at old cities, streets that slope unnaturally, windows peering from beneath the soil, doorways buried chest deep, as though a giant hand had pressed the ground upward and swallowed whole floors of stone. Walk through the grand avenues of St. Petersburg, and you may notice door frames sealed in brick just below street level. Wander the alleys of Moscow or the older towns of Siberia, and you will find staircases that descend into earth, not to basements, but to what were once open halls. Across Europe, too, in Prague, in Warsaw, in Vienna, the same curiosities appear: half buried arches, subterranean rooms that were never intended to be underground. The pattern is too broad, too consistent to dismiss as coincidence.
This is the heart of the so called mud flood theory that in some forgotten age, perhaps not so long ago, a catastrophe swept across continents, burying cities in a sudden deluge of earth and clay. Not water alone, but mud, thick and heavy, capable of swallowing the lower levels of entire cities. Imagine the scene: a bustling city at dusk, lanterns flickering in the windows, voices carrying down stone paved streets. Then from the horizon, a low roar, not thunder, not storm, but the grinding weight of earth in motion. A wave of mud, not fast like water, but irresistible, pushing forward with the weight of mountains, engulfing walls and courtyards, pressing into doorways, filling the ground floors in silence. By dawn, the city is changed. Where once there were graceful entrances, there are now windows staring blindly at street level. Where staircases once led upward, they now descend into gloom, and the people, stunned but still alive, simply rebuild above it, sealing the lower stories, creating a new ground from the ruins of the old. The mud does not shout. It does not blaze like fire nor shatter like earthquake. Its violence is quieter, its aftermath more subtle, and perhaps that is why the world does not remember. For mud can be explained away. It can be called subsidence, poor planning, the raising of streets over time. It can be rationalized until the memory of disaster fades, leaving only anomalies for later eyes to puzzle over. Yet the scale of these anomalies hints at something greater. In cities across the Russian plain, buildings bear the marks of burial, as though they once stood taller. In photographs from the 19th century, laborers are seen digging streets several meters down, unearthing facades that should never have been hidden. In parts of North America, too, pioneers found towns where lower levels lay curiously beneath the soil, as though the same hand had brushed across oceans.
Could a single event have caused this? A global catastrophe, sudden and unrecorded, that changed the face of the earth within living memory? Or was it a series of regional disasters, each erasing a part of the old world, later stitched together into silence by those who wrote the history books?
For those who whisper of Tartaria, the mud flood is no separate tale. It is the very key. They imagine that Tartaria was not simply conquered or divided, but buried, its cities, its technologies, its memory, all swallowed by a tide of earth. The mud became both shroud and silence, concealing the grandeur of a civilization so vast that later empires could not afford to acknowledge it. And so, when they built upon those ruins, they called them their own.
Picture it: a palace whose foundations once opened onto wide streets, now buried halfway, its grand doors bricked shut. A cathedral whose steps once ascended proudly, now reduced to a few uneven stairs because the rest lies beneath the soil. Ordinary people rebuilding would not question. They would simply adapt, adjusting their homes, their shops, their roads. But rulers, those who shaped the official record, may have seen an opportunity. Better to let the catastrophe be forgotten, better to erase the name of Tartaria altogether and claim its remnants as the work of their own hands.
The mud flood theory unsettles because it suggests that history is not merely incomplete, but deliberately altered. that our very cities, standing around us, are palimpsests, layers of stone, written over with new stories, hiding older truths beneath. And if Tartaria truly existed, its erasure would not only be written in books, but buried in the very ground we walk upon.
Close your eyes and imagine standing in such a city. The street beneath you is solid, paved, familiar, but beneath your feet lies another street, forgotten, where carriages once rolled and people once walked. The lower windows, dark and bricked, once shone with candlelight. The staircases that now descend into basements once rose to meet the sun. You're standing on history itself, not metaphorically, but literally, a civilization buried alive upon which another has been built. Skeptics will say streets are raised with time, floods deposit silt, builders reuse foundations, and indeed such things happen, but the breadth of the pattern across continents and cultures hints at something larger. It is not one city nor two, but dozens, perhaps hundreds, that bear the same scars, a strange synchronicity, as if the earth shifted all at once, or as if someone, somewhere, wanted to bury a whole world.
There's another layer to the theory, more unsettling still. Some whisper that the mud flood was not a natural disaster at all, but an intentional event, a weapon of Earth itself, unleashed to erase a civilization too advanced, too independent to be controlled. Was it a geological upheaval triggered by forces unknown? Or was it something harnessed, a deliberate act of destruction, its memory erased as thoroughly as the people it consumed? Such thoughts are troubling, and perhaps that is why they are spoken only in whispers. It is easier always to believe that history is steady, that progress is linear, that we rise from simplicity to complexity in a straight line. To imagine otherwise is to admit that something vast may have been lost and that we are but children living among ruins we do not fully understand.
And yet, the evidence remains, not in books, but in stone. It lingers in the bricked windows, the sunken doors, the half buried streets. It whispers in the basements that were once drawing rooms, in the staircases that now lead down instead of up. It is written in the silence of the earth, a silence that grows heavier the more one notices it.
If Tartaria was erased, the mud was both instrument and metaphor. It buried not only buildings, but memory itself. It covered the old world in a layer of forgetfulness out of which the modern age was built, and we, walking above it, rarely notice the ground beneath our feet. But some do notice. They trace the old maps, they photograph the strange windows, they dig into archives where workers of the 19th century stand waist deep in trenches, unearthing hidden floors. They ask questions others would rather leave unasked, and in their searching, the name of Tartaria surfaces again, like a word half buried, but not yet gone. The mud flood theory may never be proven. It may remain forever a whisper, a suggestion, a haunting possibility, but its power lies not in certainty, but in wonder. It asks us to look again at the familiar, to see the strange in the ordinary, to recognize that history may not be what it seems.
And so, as we walk these half buried streets in our imagination, one question rises like a shadow on the horizon. If the mud flood was real, if Tartaria was buried beneath it, then why does history remain so silent? Who benefits from forgetting? And who decided that an empire so vast should be remembered only as a phantom word on an old map? From here, our journey turns naturally to those who wrote the histories, the scholars, the chroniclers, the gatekeepers of memory, and to the strange silence they kept when faced with the name of Tartaria. History is not only what is remembered, it is also what is forgotten, and more curiously still, what is made to be forgotten. When you step into the great halls of archives, you feel the weight of centuries pressing from every shelf. Dust clings to parchment, leather bindings crack as if they themselves were weary of being opened, and yet within all these tomes, there is a silence so loud it becomes impossible to ignore.
The silence has a name, Tartaria.
Scholars who wrote of Russia's expansion, of Central Asia's Khanates, of China's borders, rarely linger on it. In passing, they might mention Tatars as raiders or subjects, as distant figures on the edge of empire. But the grander word, the sweeping Tartaria that filled so many maps, disappears like smoke. Where once it spread across atlases, it now shrinks in the words of academics until it is nothing at all, an error, a misnomer, a misunderstanding. Why such dismissal? Why such eagerness to erase?
Official explanations are tidy. They tell us that European cartographers used Tartaria as a catch-all term for lands they did not understand. They lumped together tribes, languages, and nations under one vague heading, much as they once labeled unknown coasts with sea serpents and monsters. Later, as geography improved, the name fell away, replaced by specific nations and provinces. A simple matter of progress, they say. But when you stand before an atlas where the name is written bold, spanning half the continent, the explanation feels too simple, too convenient. A label that vast, repeated for centuries, does not vanish without effort. It must be erased.
Imagine a scholar in the 19th century, quill in hand, preparing a new edition of a history of Russia. On his desk lies an old atlas where great Tartaria spreads like an empire of shadow. He frowns, dips his pen, and chooses another word. Siberia, the quill scratches. Central Asia, another stroke. Steppe peoples, another. With each mark, the vastness of Tartaria shrinks. The empire dissolves beneath the ink of redefinition. Soon, Tartaria becomes not a reality, but a relic, a curiosity of old maps, dismissed in footnotes, explained away in lectures, and in time it is no longer even mentioned. The silence grows thicker, more complete, until to speak of Tartaria is to invite ridicule.
Yet silence has texture. It feels different when it is natural, born of forgetfulness, versus when it is deliberate, crafted like a wall. The silence around Tartaria feels constructed. Too many books pass over it with too little curiosity. Too many voices agree to say nothing at all. Why? Perhaps because acknowledging Tartaria would mean admitting that history is not as linear as we are told, that empires rise and fall not in neat succession, but in layers, sometimes overlapping, sometimes erased, that the modern world may be built upon ruins it did not fully create. Such thoughts unsettle. They loosen the neat foundations upon which nations and powers rest. The historian's craft, at least as practiced in universities, often prizes certainty. Facts must be arranged, dates fixed, causes linked to effects. To admit uncertainty is to admit weakness, and so, when confronted with anomalies, the buried windows, the old maps, the persistent whispers, the historian may choose silence over speculation. Better to leave the anomaly unexplained than to risk opening doors that lead into the unknown. But silence, like mud, can conceal, it can cover an inconvenient truth, hiding it beneath the weight of consensus. And once buried, that truth becomes harder and harder to retrieve.
Imagine yourself in a library at dusk. The last light filters through high windows, dust motes drifting in golden beams. You run your fingers along the spines of volumes, histories of Russia, chronicles of Mongolia, ethnographies of Central Asia. You pull one down, heavy, its pages brittle. You scan the index. No Tartaria. Another book, another search, nothing. At last, you find a passing line. Tartary, an outdated term for certain Asiatic regions. A dismissal, nothing more. The silence presses against you like a closed door. It is in such moments that one feels the absence most keenly, for absence is itself a kind of presence. It is the shadow cast by what once was.
Some suggest that this silence was not accidental, but purposeful, that when empires rose in the 19th century, Russia consolidating its vast dominions, Britain and France extending theirs, China reasserting its boundaries, the memory of Tartaria was inconvenient. It was easier to portray these lands as wilderness, as unclaimed, as ripe for civilization, easier to erase the idea that they once belonged to a vast, independent power. For if Tartaria had existed as more than a name, then modern empires were not builders but inheritors, not pioneers but usurpers. Their foundations would not be their own, their legitimacy would be questioned, and so the silence was cultivated, like a garden carefully weeded, until nothing of Tartaria remained but whispers and anomalies. There is also another layer, more subtle still. To admit Tartaria would be to admit that history contains gaps too large to explain, that there may be knowledge, technology, and traditions lost to time, not because they were primitive, but because they were advanced. To speak of such things risks unsettling the narrative of progress, that comforting story that tells us we are the pinnacle, that all who came before were lesser, better then to keep quiet.
Yet, despite the silence, fragments survive. Old books, forgotten in corners where travelers described peoples and cities that no longer fit the official story. Maps, annotated with names no longer recognized. Folklore, in which echoes of lost empires still whisper through songs and stories.
The silence of historians then is not the end of the tale, it is the beginning of curiosity, for silence invites questions, and questions invite searching. And in that searching, the name of Tartaria rises once more, like a half buried stone revealed by the wind.
Close your eyes and imagine the scholars themselves, and some perhaps knew more than they wrote, their pens hesitating before they moved on. Others may have truly believed that Tartaria was nothing but a mistake, not worth a second thought. But in either case, the result was the same: silence, a silence that still lingers, heavy, pressing even now.
And so the story moves forward. If the scholars would not speak, perhaps the rulers might. For it was in the corridors of power, in the halls of empire, that decisions were made, decisions about what to remember and what to erase. To understand the disappearance of Tartaria, we must step from the libraries into the courts, into the smoke of battle, into the tumult of the 19th century, where empires collided and histories were rewritten. And so our journey turns to that time of upheaval when Napoleon's cannons thundered, when Russia rose, when borders shifted, and perhaps when the final traces of Tartaria were swept into silence. The 19th century was an age of upheaval, when the map of the world seemed to ripple and shift with every passing decade. Empires collided like tectonic plates, wars thundered across plains and rivers, and in the midst of all this, the silence around Tartaria thickened until it became nearly complete. It is as though the great storm of that century did not merely redraw borders, but rewrote memory itself. Imagine Europe in the early 1800s. The cannons of Napoleon thunder through the valleys of Italy, the snows of Russia, the deserts of Egypt. His armies march with banners that seem to promise a new age, a universal order, and yet behind them lies ruin. Nations collapse, kingdoms rise only to fall again, and the world watches as one man's ambition shakes the pillars of the old order. In this turmoil, whispers of Tartaria seem faint, lost beneath the roar of gunpowder.
The invasion of Russia in 1812 is often told as a tale of French defeat, of icy winter and scorched earth, but in the shadow of that colossal clash lies another story. Napoleon's maps, meticulous, carefully annotated, still bore the old name Tartary. French officers wrote of regions east of Moscow as Tartar lands. The empire had not yet vanished from European imagination, and yet by the century's end, the word was gone. Why? What happened in those decades that what had been so vast on maps could vanish in the space of a single lifetime? The answer may lie in the consolidation of empires. Russia, expanding eastward, absorbed Siberia fully into its dominion. The Khanates of Central Asia, long semi-independent, were subdued one by one, their lands folded into Russian administration. To the south, Britain and Russia faced one another across the mountains of Afghanistan in what would be called the Great Game. The empires of Europe pressed into every corner of Asia, defining, categorizing, claiming, and in that process, the old name of Tartaria became inconvenient. For to admit that Tartaria had been an empire of its own was to admit that Russia and China were not sole inheritors of those lands, but conquerors of someone else's legacy. Better then to erase the idea entirely, to rename the lands in terms that affirm the authority of the present: Siberia, Central Asia, Turkestan, Manchuria, names that spoke of geography and administration, not of an empire that no longer fit the narrative. Consider too the rise of nationalism in Europe. The 19th century was the age of nations defining themselves, of peoples writing histories that justified their existence. France, Britain, Germany, Russia all sought to craft a story that placed themselves at the center of progress. A vast, shadowy Tartaria did not fit. It threatened to complicate the story, to suggest that the modern nations were not the pinnacle, but inheritors of something older, something greater, something inconvenient, and so Tartaria was allowed to fade, its memory washed away in the tide of nationalism and empire.
There's another layer to this erasure, hidden in the smoke of war. The 19th century was not only the age of conquest, oh, it was the age of rewriting. Victories were immortalized in paintings, defeats softened in prose, and entire peoples were recast in the language of empire. Civilization and savagery became words wielded like weapons. justifying colonization. The peoples once called Tartars were reduced to tribes, nomads, subjects. Their histories dissolved into the larger narratives of the empires that claimed them. Their cities, if acknowledged, were described as provincial outposts, their achievements overlooked or attributed to others.
And so by mid century, Tartaria was no longer an empire, but a memory, fading even from memory itself. The silence of historians had become the silence of nations, a silence enforced by the sheer weight of imperial narrative. Yet fragments remain even here. In travelers' accounts, one finds mentions of great fortresses on the steppes, of cities with architecture unlike anything in Europe or Asia. In the journals of soldiers and explorers, one finds sketches of symbols, of banners, of customs that seem to belong to no known nation. These fragments, scattered like ashes, suggest that Tartaria was not entirely illusion. It was something real, something felt, something seen before it was buried beneath the stories of the new empires. Close your eyes and imagine a battlefield in Central Asia in the 1860s. Russian troops march through dust, their uniforms heavy in the heat. Ahead lies a city, its walls high, its gates carved with symbols of sun and moon. It is taken, its defenders scattered. Within months, the city is renamed, its symbols erased or replaced, its history rewritten as part of the empire. To those who conquer it, it is a victory. To those who once lived there, it is the end of a world. To us, peering back through time, it is another thread in the unraveling of Tartaria.
The 19th century was also the age of archives, of records meticulously kept, census reports, legal codes, land surveys. All the machinery of empire was put to work defining, categorizing, controlling. But in these records, Tartaria appears less and less. The more precise the empires became, the less the old name survived. It is as though the precision itself became the tool of erasure, every document a chisel carving away the memory of a once vast land. Some say this was natural, that as knowledge grew, vague names gave way to precise ones, that Tartaria was simply a placeholder replaced by the details of modern geography. But others sense something deeper, something deliberate, for erasure is not only the removal of a name, it is the denial of a possibility. By erasing Tartaria, the modern age denied that another kind of civilization had once stood, one perhaps with knowledge and power beyond what the 19th century could admit.
It is no coincidence, perhaps, that this was also the century when technology itself shifted. Steam, coal, steel, electricity, all the engines of modernity rose in these years. To imagine that another civilization, long ago, may have possessed a different technology, a cleaner, subtler, freer power, was unthinkable. It threatened the narrative of progress, the story that justified the smokestacks and the iron rails. Better then to bury Tartaria, to silence its memory, to let the mud cover not only its buildings, but the very thought of what it might have been.
And yet, silence is never complete. It has cracks, it leaks. The old maps still survive, their fragile pages whispering of a forgotten empire. The buried windows and sunken streets still stand, their stones refusing to conform to the neat stories written about them. The symbols still appear, carved into gates, woven into cloth, painted in faded colors upon walls, and the people themselves, descendants of those once called Tartars, still sing songs whose words echo with memory older than empire. The 19th century broke Tartaria in two ways: in reality by conquest and absorption, and in memory by silence and erasure. But a shadow remains, too large to vanish entirely. It lingers at the edge of the maps, at the edge of history, like a ghost waiting to be acknowledged.
And so, as the cannons of Napoleon fade, as the bureaucrats of Russia and China settle their dominions, as the empires of Europe play their great game across Asia, the question remains: why does Tartaria haunt us still? Why does its absence feel so heavy, so deliberate, so charged with secrecy? Perhaps the answer lies not in war alone, but in the symbols that survived the erasure. For even as the empire was silenced, its banners and emblems lived on, woven into the coats of arms of nations, carved into the stones of cities, carried like whispers through time. And so our path bends toward those symbols: the double headed eagle, the radiant sun, the strange motifs that reappear across lands once called Tartaria, as if they themselves refused to be erased, speaking in silence where words were forbidden. Symbols have lives of their own, they migrate across centuries. slip quietly from one empire to another, shed old meanings and take on new, all the while carrying echoes of the forgotten. When we study Tartaria, not through chronicles, not through textbooks, but through fragments, the most haunting fragments of all are its symbols. For symbols, unlike words, are harder to erase. They linger, etched into stone, woven into cloth, painted onto shields.
The double headed eagle is perhaps the most striking of these. Today it adorns the coat of arms of Russia, of Serbia, of Albania, even of the Byzantine legacy. But its true origin is older, more elusive. Two heads gazing in opposite directions, east and west, past and future, earth and sky. The bird spreads its wings, encompassing the world, uniting opposites within one body. For some, it represents empire, a dominion so vast it must look both ways. For others, it is a sign of duality, of balance, of mystery.
How curious, then, that this emblem appears again and again in lands once marked Tartaria on old maps, in Kazan, in Astrakhan, in the cities along the Volga. One finds the double headed eagle carved into gates and coins. Did it migrate there from Byzantium, as the official histories say? Or did Byzantium itself inherit it from somewhere else, perhaps from the very peoples the maps once called Tartars? The eagle refuses to tell. It only stares both ways at once, silent and eternal. Beside the eagle stands another symbol, the radiant sun. In nomadic banners, in folk embroidery, in carved wooden panels, the sun blazes with straight or wavy rays, a circle of light. It appears across Central Asia, across Siberia, across Eastern Europe. To the steppe peoples, the sun was life itself, the great clock of the plains, the companion of every journey. Yet its depictions in certain regions carry a strangeness, intricate patterns within the circle, spirals and stars that seem less like decoration than diagrams, as though recording some deeper knowledge of cycles and resonance. Could these suns have been more than ornaments? Were they symbols of a science we no longer understand? Echoes of Tartaria's rumored mastery of energy? Consider also the crescent moon, often paired with the sun, not as rivals but as companions. On ancient banners, sun and moon gaze upon each other across cloth, night and day, masculine and feminine, visible and hidden. Another duality, another sign of balance. Together they hint at a worldview that embraced harmony between opposites, a cosmology that saw the heavens as a mirror of life on earth. Travelers in earlier centuries wrote of Tartar armies carrying banners embroidered with strange devices, birds, suns, crescents, wheels, patterns that shimmered in the wind. These banners, they said, inspired fear, not only for the armies they led, but for the sense of mystery they carried, symbols unfamiliar, yet deeply resonant. Few of these banners survive, for cloth rots, and conquerors burn what they cannot claim. Yet echoes of their designs remain in folk art, in motifs that seem to surface again and again across regions far apart. Close your eyes and imagine standing before such a banner in its prime. The cloth ripples in the wind, the threads catching the sun so that the eagle gleams, the sun radiates, the crescent glows pale against the darker field. The soldiers gathered beneath it raise their voices in chant, the air vibrating with resonance. For them, the symbol is more than emblem. It is presence, protection, power. It is striking, too, how these motifs slip quietly into later empires. Russia, after its conquests, adopts the double headed eagle as its own, presenting it as the continuation of Byzantium. The Ottoman Turks bear the crescent moon and star, symbols that echo those once seen on the steppes. Even in Europe, suns and radiant stars appear in heraldry, in architecture, in secret societies. The symbols of Tartaria do not vanish. They are absorbed, claimed, reinterpreted, their origins forgotten, but their forms preserved.
Why do symbols survive when words do not? Perhaps because they bypass reason and sink directly into memory. A name can be erased from maps, a story can be rewritten, but a symbol carved into stone endures as long as the stone itself. A motif embroidered on clothing is passed down through generations, even when its meaning is no longer known. A child may wear the sun stitched onto a coat without realizing that it carries the memory of a civilization buried in silence. And so the symbols become whispers across time. They remind us that what is gone is not gone entirely. The eagle still watches, the sun still blazes, the crescent still curves, delicate and luminous. Each time we see them, a fragment of Tartaria stirs, like a shadow shifting beneath the surface of water. Some researchers gazing at these symbols see more than echoes. They see codes. The eagle, they suggest, may represent not merely empire, but a technology of vision, a capacity to see in two directions, perhaps even two dimensions. The sun, with its intricate rays, might encode knowledge of cycles, resonances, frequencies of energy. The crescent placed beside the sun may symbolize the harnessing of dual forces, the balance of opposites in creating harmony. To the rational historian, such thoughts are fantasy, but to the dreamer, they are keys glinting faintly in the lock of silence. Consider also the motifs found in architecture. In many buildings now called Russian or European, one finds solar rosettes carved into stone, geometric stars in windows, crescent shapes in arches. They are explained away as ornament, as decoration, as style, but their recurrence, precise and insistent, suggests something deeper. Architecture, like banners, speaks in symbols. Perhaps these designs were once functional as well as beautiful, aligned with energies now forgotten. And then there is the wheel, another symbol scattered across the old steplands, a circle with spokes radiating outward, simple yet profound. To some, it is the sun again. To others, it is the cycle of time, the eternal turning. In certain folk traditions, the wheel is spun in ritual, calling down blessings, aligning earth with sky. Wheels carved in stone, wheels painted on shields, each seems to whisper of movement, of cycles, of a worldview that saw no beginning and no end.
All these symbols, eagle, sun, crescent, wheel, form a tapestry. They suggest a culture not defined by text alone, but by vision, by emblem, by resonance. They hint at a civilization that communicated its truths not in books that could be burned, but in forms that could endure. And because of this, Tartaria survives, not in chronicles, but in symbols, stubborn and silent, waiting for eyes willing to see.
Close your eyes once more. Imagine walking through a ruined gate, its arch crumbling but still proud. Above it, worn by time, a carving remains, an eagle with two heads, its wings spread wide. The stone is weathered, the details faint, but the shape is unmistakable. As the wind sighs through the arch, you feel the weight of centuries, and you realize that you are standing in the presence of something erased but not destroyed. The symbol endures, the memory breathes.
And so, Tartaria continues to whisper through the language of symbols. Even when historians were silent, even when empires rebranded their conquests, the old emblems slip through the cracks, carrying fragments of memory forward. They are clues, scattered like stars across a dark sky, and if one follows them, they may yet lead to the heart of the mystery.
For the symbols speak not only of identity, but of presence, and in the presence of those who bore them, there were stories, stories of stature, of power, of beings remembered as larger than life, stories that suggest that Tartaria was not only vast, but inhabited by people who seemed to their neighbors impossibly tall, impossibly strong, impossibly enduring.
And so our journey moves onward from the banners that fluttered in the wind to the legends of the beings who carried them, the so called giants of Tartaria, whose shadows still stride across the half forgotten plains. Legends often grow in the spaces where history falls silent. When maps are redrawn, when chronicles pass over events too strange to explain, memory finds its refuge in story. So it is with the people once called Tartars. For beyond the banners, beyond the cities, beyond the silence of historians, there lingers another whisper that the men and women of Tartaria were giants.
Not giants in the sense of monsters, but in stature, in presence, in the awe they inspired. Travelers wrote of them as tall, broad shouldered figures whose very height seemed to set them apart from the peoples around them. Some accounts, perhaps colored by fear or wonder, speak of individuals so large they dwarfed ordinary men. Whether these were exaggerations, mistranslations, or genuine memory, they return again and again, scattered across centuries like echoes of a forgotten truth.
Picture the endless steppe at dawn. The sky is a pale silver, the grass shimmers with dew, and on the horizon rides a line of horsemen. As they draw near, you see that they are not only skilled riders, but imposing figures. Their armor gleams, their spears stretch high into the air, their voices carry like thunder. To a lone traveler, meeting such riders would feel like standing before a wall of living stone. And so the stories grew. The Tartars were giants. In the folk traditions of Russia and Central Asia, There are tales of bogatirs, warrior heroes of great size and strength, able to wrestle bears, to lift stones that ordinary men could not move. Some scholars dismiss these as mythic archetypes, no different from Hercules or Beowulf, but others see in them faint reflections of memory that among the steppe peoples there once were individuals of unusual stature, remembered long after their names were forgotten. Even in Europe, whispers of giants surface in chronicles of medieval battles. Soldiers facing invasions from the east described opponents taller and stronger, whose very presence on the field unnerved them. Were these exaggerations the natural inflation of fear in the face of defeat? Perhaps, yet the persistence of the theme invites curiosity. Archaeology, too, offers strange hints. In parts of Siberia, bones have been found that suggest individuals taller than the average of their time. In burial mounds across Central Asia, weapons too large for ordinary men have been unearthed, swords that would require unusual strength to wield, armor plates broad enough to cover a chest, larger than most, though rarely discussed in mainstream history. Such findings linger in archives, footnotes, museum storerooms. Close your eyes and imagine standing at the edge of a burial mound beneath the wide sky. The earth is freshly turned, the scent of soil rich and damp. Archaeologists brush at the bones of a figure far taller than those around it, their movements slow, their faces lit with awe and unease. Around the skeleton lie objects of power, a spear whose shaft, even broken, towers above them, jewelry wrought in patterns of sun and moon, remnants of cloth embroidered with symbols familiar from old banners. In that moment, one feels the veil lift. These were no mere shadows. They lived, they breathed, they walked the earth. The idea of giants unsettles because it contradicts the narrative of steady, predictable humanity. To admit that a people of unusual stature once walked among us is to admit that history may not be as uniform as we think. Yet perhaps the truth is simpler. Perhaps the Tartars were not supernatural giants, but a people who, by genetics or by way of life, tended toward greater height and strength than their neighbors, in a world where average stature was often diminished by hardship, malnutrition, and disease. Such difference would have appeared monumental. But legend, once born, has its own momentum. The tall men of the steppe became giants in story, their presence magnified by memory. And as Tartaria itself was erased, these figures became symbols of what was lost, towering shadows larger than life, embodying the grandeur of a civilization denied. Consider how stories of giants appear in so many places across the world, in Ireland, in the Americas, in the Pacific Islands, in Africa. Each culture remembers in some form a time when taller beings walked the earth. Could these be independent inventions or fragments of a deeper truth? Some whisper that Tartaria was part of this global memory, that its people were among the last of a lineage now gone. Others suggest that the giants were symbolic, not of size, but of knowledge, of presence, of power, that to stand among the Tartars was to feel small, not because they were literally enormous, but because their civilization, their command of energy and harmony towered above the rest.
The giants of Tartaria, then, may be both men and women of great physical stature, and a culture that loomed large in the memory of its neighbors. To erase Tartaria, the 19th century had to erase its giants too, reducing them to fairy tales, to exaggerations, to myths for children. But the stones remember, the bones remember, the whispers in the steppe grass remember. Imagine riding through those plains at twilight. The horizon burns with gold. The air is sharp with the scent of wild herbs, and in the distance you see the silhouette of a stone standing alone. It is taller than a man, weathered, carved faintly with lines you cannot quite decipher. Perhaps it is a gravestone, perhaps a monument, perhaps only a boulder placed by nature. But as you approach, the sense grows that it belongs to someone larger, someone whose presence still lingers. You feel small beneath its shadow, as though standing beside the grave of a giant. In the end, whether literal or symbolic, the giants of Tartaria remind us that something has been lost, that there was once a people or a memory of a people whose scale exceeded ours, not only in body, but in imagination, and their absence is felt as keenly as the absence of the empire itself. The silence of historians did not merely erase a name, it erased presence. It reduced towering figures to shadows, to curiosities, to tales told around fires. But in the cracks of silence, the giants still stride. They appear in folklore, in the oversized weapons found in earth, in the ruins of cities whose scale seems disproportionate to their supposed builders. They stride through the collective unconscious, reminders of a past larger than we are allowed to imagine.
And so the story of Tartaria moves forward from giants to the cities they inhabited, cities whose architecture still challenges explanation. For what kind of people, whether giants in body or in spirit, could build the immense, intricate, and enduring structures that dot the old world, structures so grand that even today we struggle to understand them? And thus our path leads onward to the strange and imposing architecture attributed to Tartaria, buildings whose scale and mystery still rise, half buried above the silence of history. Cities speak even when their inhabitants have long vanished. They speak in stone, in symmetry, in lines that do not fade though centuries pass. When one walks through the great boulevards of St. Petersburg, or the echoing courtyards of Kazan, or the strange, half forgotten towns scattered across the Russian plain, one feels something uncanny. These places seem too grand for the time they are said to have been built, too vast, too intricate, too carefully aligned. The official histories tell us that St. Petersburg, for instance, was built in the 18th century by decree of Peter the Great. A swampy, inhospitable delta was transformed into a jewel of palaces, cathedrals, and avenues in scarcely a generation. But look closely, and questions rise like mist. How could a city of such scale, with stone facades stretching endlessly, domes rising into the sky, and columns carved with precision, have been raised so swiftly in a land with little infrastructure at the time?
Some whisper that it was not built at all, at least not by the hands credited with its creation. They suggest it was uncovered, inherited, repurposed, the bones of Tartaria dressed in new imperial clothing. That the grandeur attributed to the czars was, in truth, a legacy taken from those who came before.
Consider the Winter Palace. Its vastness is staggering, its rooms numbered in the thousands, its halls endless, its facades adorned with classical detail that rivals Rome and Paris. Could such a wonder truly have risen in the short decades of its supposed construction? Or does it stand upon older foundations, a skeleton already waiting when the new rulers claimed it as their own? Elsewhere in Russia, one finds similar anomalies. Cathedrals with onion domes so tall and delicate that even modern engineers puzzle at how they were raised, fortresses with walls so thick and gates so intricate that they seem designed for a different age. In Central Asia, too, ruins dot the landscape. Towers of brick and stone whose age is uncertain, whose builders are unnamed. They stand half buried in soil, their lower levels swallowed, their upper arches still reaching defiantly toward the heavens.
Close your eyes and imagine walking through one of these forgotten cities. The streets are empty, the air heavy with silence. You run your hand along a wall, its stone smooth, its joints precise, as if carved not by human hand, but by some machine we no longer possess. Light falls through arches onto patterns in the floor, spirals, stars, sacred geometries that echo the symbols of the banners. The air vibrates faintly, as though the space itself remembers song. What were these buildings for? Were they churches, palaces, fortresses, or were they something else entirely? Some whisper that their designs suggest function beyond mere shelter, domes shaped to resonate with sound, spires pointed not only for beauty, but for energy, perhaps harnessing the forces of earth and sky, vaulted halls that amplify voice and chant until they seem to move not only the ear but the soul.
To those who seek Tartaria, these are not coincidences. They are evidence, not of myth, but of a civilization with knowledge now forgotten. A civilization whose architecture was both art and instrument, beauty and utility, harmony and power. To stand in such a place is to feel the echo of that knowledge, like a faint hum beneath the soles of your feet.
And yet, official history insists otherwise. It tells us these were simply the works of empire, of czars and khans, of architects trained in Europe, of laborers driven by command. But the pace, the scale, the precision, these remain unsettling. For in an age without modern machinery, to build on such scale would have required miracles of labor, millions of hands, decades of toil. Yet the records show cities rising almost overnight, entire capitals appearing where none had stood before. Could it be that these were not built from scratch but adapted? That the czars and khans found ruins, grand, enduring, impossible to ignore, and claimed them, painting them in new colors, naming them in new tongues, while the truth of their origin sank beneath the mud? There are photographs taken in the early days of cameras that show workers digging deep around such buildings, revealing lower levels, entire floors hidden beneath the earth. Were these basements newly built or remnants of a time when the streets lay lower before the mud flood buried them? The evidence lingers, silent but stubborn. Imagine standing at the base of a cathedral, its windows staring blankly from beneath the soil. You descend a staircase into what is called the basement, and there, beneath layers of dust, you find walls carved with the same care as those above. Not storage, not afterthought, but original design, buried as though the earth itself rose to swallow them. Such details hint at a story untold, a story of catastrophe and inheritance rather than creation.
Even beyond Russia, similar mysteries appear in Prague, in Budapest, in Paris, in Rome. Buildings bear the same anomalies: sunken levels, hidden facades, proportions out of step with the records. In North America, too, in the older quarters of San Francisco and New Orleans, photographs show buildings half buried, their ground floors sealed, their histories rewritten as if they had always been that way. Could the architecture of Tartaria have stretched even farther, across oceans, across continents, its legacy global rather than local?
The thought unsettles, but it also inspires wonder. To imagine a civilization so vast, so skilled that its works still stand across the world, hidden in plain sight, is to imagine a past far grander than we have been told. And if this is true, then we are not the builders of the modern world, but the inheritors of ruins, tenants in houses whose foundations we do not fully understand. Symbols carved into these buildings deepen the mystery: suns, stars, spirals, geometric rosettes, patterns that echo across cultures, across continents, suggesting a shared language of form. Historians call them decoration, mere flourishes of style, but to those who listen with different ears, they are more. They are codes, remnants of knowledge inscribed in stone, reminders of harmony between matter and energy, earth and sky.
Perhaps this is why the architecture of Tartaria unsettles so deeply, because it suggests that what we think of as progress may not be linear, that we may not be at the pinnacle, but rather in the aftermath, that what we call civilization is a second growth, sprouting in the ruins of something larger, more mysterious, more attuned to forces we no longer understand. Close your eyes and imagine one of these cities in its prime. The domes gleam, the spires hum faintly, the streets glow with a light that seems not to come from flame. People walk unhurried beneath colonnades, their voices echoing in harmony with the stone. Fountains bubble with crystalline water, not pumped, but flowing as if alive. At night, the stars align with towers, their positions marked, their energies channeled, their light reflected in patterns of stone. The city itself feels alive, as though it breathes with its inhabitants, as though it is not merely a place, but a companion.
And then imagine that same city buried, its lower floors swallowed, its spires claimed by new rulers, its purpose forgotten. Its beauty remains, but its meaning is lost. It becomes a palace, a church, a fortress, names that fit the new order but do not reveal the old. It becomes impossible architecture, explained away, yet still standing, still whispering to those who pause long enough to listen. The silence of historians, the conquests of empires, the mud that buried lower levels, all these were layers of forgetting. But the architecture endures. It refuses to vanish. It continues to stand even when stripped of its name, even when denied its origin. It is the most stubborn witness of Tartaria, carved not in ink, but in stone. And so, as we linger among these silent cities, another question emerges. If Tartaria's buildings still stand, if its symbols still whisper, if its presence lingers in stone and soil, then why was it erased? Who had the power to bury not only a people, but a civilization, to overwrite their legacy with new names, new stories, new maps? And so our journey must turn to the powers themselves, the empires that rose in the wake of Tartaria's silence, the rulers who claimed its ruins, and the possibility of collusion in its erasure. We step from stone into shadow, into the politics of forgetting, where silence was not accident but design. History, as it reaches us, is not a neutral mirror. It is a tapestry woven by the hands of those who rule, stitched with choices of what to reveal and what to hide. To understand the disappearance of Tartaria, we must step into the chambers of power where rulers and scholars, priests and generals decided which stories would endure and which would vanish.
Imagine a long table, polished dark, surrounded by men in heavy robes and uniforms. Maps are spread across its surface, candles flickering in brass holders, shadows dancing across inked lines. Russia, swelling eastward, China, consolidating its frontiers, the Vatican, guardian of sacred archives, each power with its own interests, its own narratives, its own reasons to control what people remembered. Russia, the inheritor of the steppes. In the 18th and 19th centuries, Russia was a vast empire on the move, from the forests of Europe to the icy reaches of Siberia. From the Baltic to the Black Sea, its armies and settlers pressed outward, absorbing lands that had once belonged to others. The Khanates of Central Asia fell, one by one, their banners lowered, their cities renamed. For Russia, Tartaria was both opportunity and threat. On the one hand, to acknowledge that the steppes had once belonged to a great civilization was to risk undermining the legitimacy of conquest. On the other, to erase that civilization was to present Russia as the sole civilizer, the builder of order out of wilderness. And so, the old names faded from maps, replaced by Siberia, Turkestan, and Central Asia. The double-headed eagle, once perhaps a Tartar emblem, became the symbol of Russia itself. Recast as inheritance from Byzantium, what had been taken became what had always been. Picture a czar standing in a palace whose columns gleam with impossible grandeur. He does not wonder who first raised them. He claims them as his own, his crest carved above their doors, his banners hung in their halls. To his subjects, the city is Russian. To history, it becomes Russian. The silence thickens, and Tartaria vanishes further into shadow. China, the keeper of boundaries. On the other side of the steppes, China too had reasons to diminish Tartaria. For centuries, Chinese dynasties had faced threats from nomadic powers to the north, the Xiongnu, the Mongols, the Manchu. The very memory of a vast steppe empire was dangerous, a reminder of vulnerability. Better then to fold those lands into the Chinese narrative, to name them Inner Mongolia, Manchuria, Xinjiang, frontiers defined by Chinese terms, governed by Chinese authority. In official Chinese histories, Tartaria becomes nothing more than vague lands beyond the Great Wall, populated by restless tribes, occasionally united but never truly sovereign. The possibility of a parallel empire, a civilization equal in scale and perhaps in knowledge, is quietly set aside. The Great Wall itself becomes the symbol, China as civilization, Tartaria as wilderness. And once the narrative is set, the archives close upon it like stone doors.
The Vatican, the silent archivist. And then there is the Vatican, whose libraries and vaults guard not only the words of Scripture, but the records of centuries. Within its walls lie maps, manuscripts, chronicles collected from across Europe and beyond. Some say that among them are records of Tartaria, detailed accounts of travelers, documents that confirm what the maps suggest. Yet if such records exist, they are not widely shared. The Vatican, with its long tradition of secrecy, has often chosen silence over revelation. Why would the church be silent? Perhaps because the existence of a vast, forgotten civilization raises troubling questions about providence, about the universality of its narrative. Perhaps because Tartaria's symbols, the sun, the crescent, the eagle, resonate uncomfortably with Christian emblems, suggesting parallel streams of sacred meaning, or perhaps because collusion, tacit or explicit, served all parties. Russia and China to consolidate their conquests, the Vatican to preserve its authority as custodian of the world's story, the mechanics of erasure. Together, these powers created a silence more powerful than any single empire could. Russia absorbed the land, renaming it. China redefined its borders, diminishing it. The Vatican withheld or reinterpreted records, allowing the name to fade from memory. The 19th century became the crucible in which the narrative of modern history was forged, and Tartaria did not fit. Erasure is not accomplished by fire alone, it is achieved by replacement. New names overwrite old, new stories displace the forgotten. In textbooks, Tartaria becomes a misnomer, a cartographic curiosity. In popular memory, it becomes nothing at all. The people who remain are given other labels, their songs and stories folded into the cultures of empire. And as generations pass, the silence feels natural, as though it had always been there.
Imagine a child in 1880 sitting in a school in Moscow, tracing a map in his textbook. The names are familiar: Russia, Siberia, China, Central Asia. He has never heard of Tartaria. His teacher has not either. The old maps with their vast inscriptions gather dust in archives, unseen, the silence is complete, and yet beneath it, the stones, the symbols, the anomalies remain, waiting for rediscovery.
A deliberate amnesia. Some may say this is conspiracy, and perhaps it is, but even without formal agreement, powers can collude through shared convenience. Russia did not wish to admit a conquered empire. China did not wish to acknowledge a rival. The Vatican did not wish to complicate its narrative. Each had reason to prefer silence, and so silence was chosen. Yet silence has limits. It cannot erase what is carved into stone, what is woven into cloth, what is whispered in song. And so fragments of Tartaria survive despite the collusion of powers. They survive in the buried windows of cities, in the impossible grandeur of architecture, in the double headed eagle perched upon coats of arms. They survive in the stories of giants, in the folk songs of the steppes, in the stubborn presence of a word that still lingers on ancient maps.
Close your eyes and imagine again that long table in a chamber of power. The candles burn low, the maps are rolled away, the men depart in silence. Outside, snow falls softly, covering the streets in white. The silence within mirrors the silence without, muffling, concealing, erasing. But snow melts, and beneath it, the earth remembers.
The collusion of empires was powerful, but not perfect, for history, like the earth itself, has cracks, and through those cracks, truth seeps slowly, persistently, inevitably. And so, as we leave the halls of empire, we turn once more to the earth, to the fragments uncovered by spade and shovel, to the artifacts that refuse to fit the narrative, to the archaeological hints that Tartaria may not be myth, but memory.
From silence and erasure, our journey moves into discovery, to the strange artifacts and findings that break through the veil, reminding us that the past is never fully buried. The earth keeps secrets better than any vault. Beneath fields, beneath forests, beneath the quiet squares of cities, lie fragments of lives once lived, stories once told, technologies once used. Archaeologists brush dust from objects. Museums lock them in glass, but the questions they raise remain unanswered. When we listen closely, they seem to whisper not only of forgotten peoples, but of entire civilizations buried in silence. Among those whispers are the artifacts some claim belong to Tartaria.
Bones and tools that do not fit. Across Siberia, in remote valleys and windswept plains, excavations have uncovered human remains larger than expected, skeletons whose height seems to exceed the averages of their time, skulls broad and elongated, bones sturdy as though shaped for a different scale of life. Most are quietly catalogued, explained as anomalies, dismissed as rare but natural variation. And yet, taken together, they suggest something unusual, that the legends of Tartarian giants may hold some echo of truth. Beside these bones lie tools and weapons whose size puzzles even the most pragmatic eye. Swords too heavy for ordinary men, spearheads forged for shafts far taller than a human body, shields that could cover two at once. Were these ceremonial, symbolic, exaggerated for display, or did they once belong to warriors of uncommon stature, remembered in folklore as giants of the steppe? Machines before machines. In museums across Eurasia, tucked into corners, one sometimes finds objects that seem out of place in their supposed centuries. Intricate gears, wheels etched with markings, devices whose purpose is obscure. Some resemble astrolabes, others timepieces, others fragments of something more complex. Scholars classify them as curiosities, perhaps imported from elsewhere, perhaps misunderstood by those who unearthed them. Yet a question lingers: what if these were not imports, but remnants of knowledge native to Tartaria?
Consider the Antikythera mechanism of Greece, a marvel of gears and astronomical calculation centuries ahead of its supposed time. If such an object could exist in the Mediterranean, why not on the steppes? Perhaps the fragments we dismiss as oddities were once parts of devices equally sophisticated, tools for measuring the stars, for harnessing resonance, for keeping cycles of energy and time. ornaments of hidden meaning. Folk jewelry from Central Asia often bears symbols of sun and moon, of spirals and stars, carved or cast with exquisite care. Officially, these are decorative expressions of cultural taste, but to those who look deeper, they resemble diagrams, patterns too precise to be mere ornament. Spirals echo the paths of galaxies. Rosettes resemble waveforms. Interlocking circles suggest harmonics. Were these pieces not only adornments, but carriers of knowledge, a wearable memory of Tartaria's understanding of the cosmos?
Even in European collections, one finds embroidered cloths from the Volga or Siberian tribes, bearing designs that resonate with architecture elsewhere. The same rosettes, the same stars, the same crescents, fragments of a language not spoken in words, but stitched, carved, cast, passed down through generations until their meaning was forgotten, but their forms endured.
The mystery of maps and globes. Perhaps the most haunting artifacts are not bones or weapons, but maps themselves. In certain archives, old globes and atlases show rivers that no longer exist, mountains misaligned, coastlines drawn with uncanny accuracy centuries before satellites. Among them, the name Tartaria sprawls confidently across the north. These maps are artifacts of memory, not just of geography. They testify to knowledge once held and later denied. Imagine standing before a globe in a dim museum hall. The paint has faded, the surface cracked, but the inscriptions remain. Tartaria spreads across Asia like a ghost, a reminder of how differently the world was once conceived. This globe is not simply a cartographic error, it is an artifact of belief, a testament to what once was considered fact. To hold it is to hold a fragment of a vanished world.
Ruins and foundations. Beyond portable artifacts, there are ruins themselves, silent, immovable, undeniable, foundations buried beneath newer cities, arches unearthed during construction, stones carved with precision that defies the tools of their time. Workers in 19th century Russia, photographed knee deep in trenches, revealed lower levels of buildings that had long been hidden. They unearthed arches, doorways, chambers filled with soil. These were not basements added later, but original structures buried as though by catastrophe.
Each such discovery is an artifact in its own right, a piece of evidence that cities we take for granted may be older, stranger, and more complex than we are told. Perhaps they were Tartarian, inherited by new rulers, their origins quietly reassigned.
Silence around the finds.
What is most curious is not that such artifacts exist, but that so often they are ignored. A sword too large, a bone too long, a map too strange. Each is explained away, filed, forgotten. Museums display them without emphasis. Scholars dismiss them as curiosities. Yet to those who look closely, they are cracks in the narrative, windows into a past that refuses to stay buried. Why such silence? Perhaps because to admit their significance is to question the foundations of history itself, to suggest that Tartaria was real, that it left behind bones, machines, symbols, cities, is to admit that history as written is incomplete, perhaps deliberately so. And that admission threatens not only scholarship but power. A whisper in the soil.
Close your eyes and imagine kneeling in the dust of a step excavation. The wind blows softly, carrying the scent of grass and earth. Your brush reveals the curve of a gear, small but intricate, its teeth still sharp, though centuries old. You lift it gently, and in your hand you hold a mystery. Was it part of a slock, a compass, a machine we cannot name? The artifact does not answer, it only waits, whispering in silence. Elsewhere in the cellar of an old building, you find a doorway bricked over, a staircase leading into earth. The stones are smooth, their edges precise, as though made with tools sharper than any chisel. Who built this? When? Why is it buried? Again the silence presses, heavier than the soil itself. Artifacts are fragments of truth, scattered like breadcrumbs. They lead us toward questions, never toward certainty, and perhaps that is why they unsettle, because they remind us that what we know is only a fraction of what once was.
Toward the present, the unearthed artifacts of Tartaria, bones, tools, ornaments, maps, ruins, do not prove a single narrative, but they hint, they suggest, they beckon. They are like voices in a dream, half heard but persistent, urging us to remember. And perhaps, in remembering, we begin to see the shape of Tartaria not as myth, but as memory, a civilization erased yet still present in fragments, still whispering through what the earth refuses to conceal. From here, our path moves into language itself, the forgotten scripts, the lost tongues, the symbols that hint at words once spoken and written, the voices of Tartaria that still echo faintly across time. A civilization is not only stone and symbol, it breathes most clearly through its words. Languages are like rivers. They carry memory, they carve meaning, they shape the landscape of thought. When a language disappears, it is as if a river has dried. Its bed remains, but its water no longer flows. If Tartaria once existed as more than a cartographer's invention, then somewhere in the silence of history, its words must have lived. And perhaps they still linger, faint as echoes across the steppe.
The vanishing of tongues.
In the Chronicles of Russia, the term Tatar or Tartar comes to mean many things. It is applied broadly, sometimes carelessly, to Turkic tribes, to Mongolic peoples, to anyone who rode the plains beyond the settled lands. Yet within this name may lie fragments of something larger, something unified. Was Tartar only a label imposed by outsiders, or did it reflect a people with a shared tongue, a language of Tartaria?
Linguists search for traces in dialects still spoken across Central Asia, Siberia, and beyond. The Turkic languages, stretching from Anatolia to Yakutia, bear similarities that suggest ancient unity. The Mongolic tongues, though distinct, share rhythms and structures that feel like cousins. In folk songs recorded in remote villages, words surface that belong to neither, as though they are remnants of another branch, now vanished. Could these be whispers of a Tartarian language, erased not only from books but from mouths, surviving only in syllables sung by memory?
Carvings and symbols.
On old buildings scattered across the steppes, in half buried churches and ruined fortresses, one sometimes finds inscriptions. They are not always legible. Some are carved in scripts resembling Cyrillic, others in Arabic, still others in runes that seem to belong to no known alphabet. Scholars classify them as miscopied, decorative, or simply misunderstood, but to those who believe in Tartaria, they are fragments of a forgotten script, the writing of a language now silenced.
Imagine running your fingers across such an inscription, the grooves weathered by centuries of wind and rain, the letters or symbols curl and bend like waves of grass, their meaning hidden. Were they prayers, records, names? The stone does not tell, but the act of carving itself suggests that words once lived here, that someone once wished to be remembered in writing. The language of wind and song. Perhaps, though, Tartaria's language was not confined to stone. Nomadic peoples often carried their histories not in books, but in songs. Oral traditions can endure for centuries, carried in memory, passed from elder to child, sung beside fires under the endless sky. In the chants of Siberian shamans, in the epics sung by Kazakh bards, in the throat songs of Tuvan singers, there are rhythms that feel older than the nations that now claim them. They rise and fall like wind across the plains, voices layered with harmonics, sounds that seem to resonate not only in the ear but in the bones. Close your eyes and imagine sitting by such a fire. The flames crackle, sparks rising into the night. An elder begins to sing, the voice deep and resonant, weaving words you do not know but somehow feel. The syllables roll like distant thunder, then soften like a lullaby. The song is not only story, it is language itself, preserved not in grammar but in melody. Perhaps here lies Tartaria's true memory, hidden not in archives but in breath.
Threads across the world.
Strangely, echoes of these sounds appear far beyond the steppes. Linguists note similarities between certain Central Asian words and those of distant peoples. In Finland, in Hungary, even in the Americas, are these coincidences, accidents of sound, or do they point to an older unity, a time when Tartaria's language, or something akin to it, spread far wider than maps now allow?
The possibility unsettles, for it suggests that Tartaria was not merely a regional empire, but part of a vast network of human connection, its words scattering like seeds across continents. Even today, in the songs of the Sami reindeer herders, in the chants of Native American tribes, in the patterns of epic poetry sung in Mongolia, faint threads connect. Perhaps they are only resemblances, or perhaps they are the final whispers of a once great tongue, fragments of a language erased but not fully silenced, the silence of writing. If Tartaria had a written language, where are its books? Where are its chronicles, its letters, its records? The silence here is most haunting, for if Tartaria was truly an empire, it must have had scribes, archives, libraries, yet none are presented, none are shown. Were they destroyed, burned in conquest? hidden in the vaults of empires that inherited its lands? Or were they rebranded, their words rewritten in the alphabets of conquerors, their authorship reassigned?
The Vatican's libraries, closed to most eyes, are said to hold manuscripts no scholar outside its walls has seen. In the archives of Russia and China, countless documents lie uncatalogued, untranslated. Could among them be writings of Tartaria, mislabeled, misattributed, or deliberately concealed? The question lingers, heavy as the silence itself. Language as memory. Even if no books survive, language has other ways of enduring. It survives in place names, in the words that cling to rivers and mountains long after their meanings are forgotten. Across Russia and Central Asia, countless place names bear endings and sounds that seem older than the languages now spoken there. Some are Turkic, some Mongolic, some untraceable. To those who search, these are fossils of speech, preserved in geography. They are like footprints in stone, evidence that words has once walked here.
Listen to the names aloud, and you may feel their rhythm. They rise and fall with the cadence of wind, of hoofbeats, of rivers flowing. They are the music of a tongue now gone, but not entirely. They are Tartaria's language, hidden in plain sight.
Words of wind and silence. Perhaps the most fitting image of Tartaria's language is the wind itself. It moves unseen, yet carries sound, carries whispers, carries memory. The people of the steppe lived by the wind, reading its shifts, listening to its voices. Perhaps their language too was of the wind, fluid, resonant, hard to pin down. A language of song more than of script, a language that vanished not because it was weak, but because it was never meant to be caged in ink. Close your eyes and imagine standing on the steppe at dusk. The grass ripples like water, the horizon glows with fading light, and the wind rises. It carries with it faint syllables, half formed, indistinct, but insistent. You cannot translate them, yet you feel them. They are words without words, the remnants of a language erased but not gone. They are the voice of Tartaria, still speaking in the silence. Toward the present, modern ears may not hear this language clearly, but it lingers in fragments, in the chants of shamans, in the songs of herders, in the names of rivers, in the echoes of inscriptions worn by time. It lingers in the symbols carved into stone, symbols that may themselves be a kind of language. And though the historians are silent, though the archives remain closed, the earth itself remembers. Tartaria's language may be forgotten, but it is not lost. It is the riverbed waiting for rain, the echo waiting for voice, the silence waiting to be broken. And so, from the forgotten words, we move to the living blood, to the question of whether Tartaria truly vanished or whether its people still live among us, their customs and songs carrying fragments of a lost empire into the present day. Civilizations may be conquered, cities may crumble, languages may fade into silence, but people endure. Blood is more stubborn than stone. It flows quietly through centuries, carrying with it memories older than words, older than books, older than maps. If Tartaria was once an empire, then somewhere in the present, its descendants still walk among us. Perhaps they no longer bear the name, perhaps they no longer know the banners, but in their eyes, their songs, their customs, fragments of that lost world survive. The puzzle of peoples. Today, across the vast lands once labeled Tartaria, countless peoples live. Tatars of Kazan and Astrakhan, Bashkirs in the Urals, Yakuts in Siberia, Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, Uzbeks, Turkmen, Mongols, and many more. Each has its own history, its own tongue, its own traditions. Yet in old maps, they were all folded together beneath one name, Tartaria.
Was this mere ignorance, the broad brush of outsiders who saw only vastness where there was diversity? Or does their kinship run deeper, a shared origin later divided by conquest and redefinition? Perhaps Tartaria was not a single tribe, but a federation, a tapestry of peoples united beneath a larger banner. If so, then each of these groups may carry a fragment of its legacy, like shards of a shattered mirror reflecting the same forgotten face. The Tatars of Kazan.
Consider the Tatars of Kazan, long regarded as heirs of the Golden Horde. Their city, with its white Kremlin and shining towers, sits like a jewel on the Volga. Their language is Turkic, their faith Islamic, their customs rich with song and dance. To historians, they are descendants of Mongol conquerors, but to those who whisper of Tartaria, they are more than that. They are guardians of memory, carrying in their very name the echo of a vanished empire. In their festivals, symbols of the sun and moon appear in embroidery, in jewelry, in ritual. In their songs, rhythms linger that resemble those of peoples far to the east. In their stature and bearing, travelers once remarked upon a proud presence, a sense of being heirs to something vast. Could Kazan itself, with its fusion of styles, its ancient walls half buried in earth, be a remnant of Tartaria's heart, the Yakuts of Siberia? Far to the north, in the frozen reaches of Siberia, the Yakut people live where winters last most of the year. Their language, too, is Turkic, yet their myths speak of giants, of sky gods, of journeys across endless steppes. They craft jewelry with spirals and suns. They sing throat songs that resonate like the hum of ancient domes. How did a Turkic people find themselves so far north, in lands harsher than most can endure? Some say they are exiles, survivors of upheavals that shattered the old world, pushed into the wilderness by forces of conquest and catastrophe. Close your eyes and imagine a Yakut shaman standing beneath the northern lights. The sky shimmers with green and violet fire, the air sharp as glass. He beats a drum carved with suns and moons, his chant rising in harmonics that echo the very vibrations of the earth. In that chant may live syllables older than empire, words of Tartaria disguised as prayer. The Kazakhs and the nomadic heart. Across the steppes of Kazakhstan, the nomadic life endured long after cities rose and fell. Riders still gallop across plains where Tartaria once spread, their herds following the rhythm of grass and season. The Kazakhs tell epics of heroes larger than life, men who ride endlessly, who sing of the stars, who measure time by the wind. Their tents, circular, domed, resonant, resemble not only homes, but echoes of the grand domes of Tartarian architecture. Perhaps these nomads are not remnants, but continuations, preserving the essence of Tartaria in movement rather than in stone. If Tartaria was an empire of harmony with sky and earth, then the Kazakh nomads still embody it, their songs and rides carrying memory even when the name itself is lost. The Bashkirs and the Eagle. In the Ural Mountains dwell the Bashkirs, whose banners bear the image of the horse and the eagle. Their traditions blend Turkic, Finnic, and Mongolic threads, a tapestry of kinship that defies neat classification. They tell tales of origins in the East, of migrations across vast distances, of ancestors who once ruled far more land than they now possess. The eagle, symbol of Tartaria itself, still spreads its wings in their emblems. Perhaps unconsciously, they preserve the very image that once stood for an empire erased, scattered seeds. But the bloodlines of Tartaria may extend beyond those who still dwell on the steppes. In Europe, some noble families trace mysterious origins eastward, hinting at unions with steppe princes and princesses. In Turkey, echoes of steppe ancestry live in language and custom. Even in the Americas, among native peoples, similarities in song and symbol suggest ancient connections, as though Tartaria's children scattered far, carried by migrations we no longer remember. The Mongols, too, who once thundered westward, may themselves be both kin and heir. Were they conquerors of Tartaria, or its brothers, or its children? The lines blur, and perhaps they are not meant to be separate, for empires overlap, blood mingles, and what survives in legend is rarely pure but always enduring. Blood without memory. The tragedy of Tartaria's descendants is not that they vanished, but that they forgot. Names were changed, histories rewritten, faiths reshaped. A Kazakh child learns he is Kazakh, not Tartarian. A Tatar child learns of Mongol Khans, not of Tartarian kings. A Yakut child sings of spirits, not of a lost empire. And yet in each of them blood flows that once belonged to the same river, now scattered into many streams. Close your eyes and imagine walking through a market in Central Asia. You hear voices in many tongues, Turkic, Russian, Mongolic. You smell spices, leather, wool. You see embroidered cloth with suns and moons, carved bone with spirals, jewelry with double-headed eagles. None of the sellers call them Tartarian. None even know the name. And yet everything you see is Tartaria, hidden in plain sight, carried in hands that no longer remember what they hold. The persistence of spirit. Bloodlines are not only genetic, they are spiritual, cultural, emotional. In the resilience of steppe peoples, in their songs, in their pride, Tartaria endures. It may be fragmented, dispersed, forgotten, but it has not died. Empires cannot erase the human spirit. Silence cannot still the drumbeat of memory. Perhaps this is Tartaria's greatest legacy, not a single nation, but 1,000 descendants, each carrying a fragment. Together they form a mosaic, scattered but luminous like stars across the night sky. Each glows faintly on its own, but together they reveal a constellation, a shape hidden unless one steps back far enough to see. Toward the hidden catastrophe.
If Tartaria's people still walk among us, then Tartaria itself has not entirely died. It has only been renamed, reframed, forgotten. But how did it fall? What catastrophe, what deliberate erasure, what rewriting of history could reduce an empire to silence? The buried cities, the mud floods, the silence of historians all point toward a great upheaval. And so our path now leads into that moment of fracture. The catastrophe, whether natural or designed, that drowned Tartaria in mud and silence and reshaped the world so completely that its memory became a whisper instead of a song. Every civilization has its twilight, its moment when the light falters and shadows lengthen. For some, decline comes slowly, like a candle burning low. For others, it comes in fire and conquest, swift and merciless. But for Tartaria, the whispers suggest something different still, a catastrophe so strange, so immense that it did not merely topple cities or scatter armies, but rewrote the memory of the world itself. They call it the Great Reset.
A world before the fall. Imagine first the world as it might have been. Across the steppes stretched cities with domes that sang in harmony, towers aligned with the stars, plazas glowing faintly with energy drawn from the very air. Caravans traveled without fear, guided by landmarks older than any empire, by resonances tuned into stone and sky. Knowledge was not hoarded, but built into architecture itself, available to any who stood within the right space, who sang the right note, who listened to the hum of the earth.
This world was not primitive, nor was it ours. It was something else, a parallel path, a civilization that lived in resonance with forces we have forgotten, and then suddenly it was gone.
The mud flood catastrophe. One of the most haunting theories tied to Tartaria is the mud flood, a sudden inundation of soil and clay rising like a tide across continents, streets buried overnight, buildings swallowed to their second or third stories, doorways and windows bricked shut because they now opened into earth.
In city after city, from St. Petersburg to Kazan, from Novgorod to Odessa, anomalies remain. Windows half buried, staircases descending into what should have been open air, foundations lost beneath tons of soil. In photographs from the 19th century, workmen dig streets meters deep, revealing facades hidden below ground. The official explanation speaks of street level adjustments, of centuries of gradual buildup, but the pattern is too consistent, too sudden, too global. What if instead a great wave of mud rolled across the world, swallowing the lower halves of cities? What if it came not centuries apart, but all at once, a catastrophe unrecorded or recorded and later erased?
Close your eyes, picture the silence before it struck. A city gleams in morning sun, domes shining, fountains flowing, markets alive with color and sound. Then from the horizon comes not floodwater but something heavier, darker, relentless, a wall of earth in motion, slow but unstoppable, pushing into streets, filling courtyards, pressing against windows until they shatter. By nightfall, the lower city is gone. Only the upper stories remain, and the people, stunned, rebuild above the burial. The mud conceals, but it also erases. For once a building is half buried, its origin becomes uncertain. Was it always thus? Who can tell when records are scarce, when conquerors rename the ruins, when silence spreads faster than memory? Fire from the sky.
Some suggest the mud flood alone cannot explain the scale of loss. They speak instead of fire from the sky, comets, meteors, celestial events that rain destruction upon the earth. Ancient chronicles across cultures mention strange fires, skies alight with falling stars. Nights turned to day, perhaps Tartaria's cities, proud and resonant, were struck from above, their domes shattered, their towers toppled. Archaeologists sometimes uncover layers of fused stone, as if structures were melted by heat beyond any known fire. In Siberia and Central Asia, circular depressions scar the land, their origins mysterious, attributed by science to meteor impacts but left largely unexplored. Could these be the scars of the catastrophe that ended Tartaria?
Imagine the sky splitting, streaks of fire trailing across the heavens, the air alive with thunder. People look upward in awe and terror as towers tremble, as domes crack, as walls glow red before collapsing. To them, it must have seemed as though the heavens themselves had turned against them. The Great Freeze.
Others point to climate itself. In the 19th century, Europe endured what was called the Little Ice Age, winters harsher than memory, summers brief and cold, famines swept across continents. Could Tartaria, stretching across Siberia and Central Asia, have been broken by such a change? Its plains turned barren, its rivers frozen, its people scattered by hunger, the mud flood, the fires, the freezes, perhaps all part of one great upheaval, a reset of Earth's balance, natural or otherwise, a deliberate reset. Yet the most unsettling suggestion is that this was no accident of nature, but an act of intent, that the catastrophe, whether mud, fire, or ice, was used or even caused to wipe the slate clean, to end one world and begin another.
History, after all, is written by victors, and what greater victory than to erase the very memory of your predecessor? If Tartaria held knowledge of free energy, of resonance, of harmony with the earth, such knowledge threatened the rise of empires built on scarcity and control. To erase Tartaria was to ensure that the modern world, with its coal, its oil, its wires and engines, would reign unchallenged. Picture rulers in darkened halls centuries ago, realizing that to dominate the future, they must bury the past, not only literally beneath mud and ruin, but figuratively in books and chronicles, in schools and maps. A reset was not only physical, it was intellectual, a wiping clean, a rewriting, a silencing, the aftermath.
What remains after such a reset? People bewildered, rebuilding atop ruins, inheriting structures they no longer understand, technologies lost, dismissed as myths or stripped for parts, songs that once spoke of resonance, now sung only as lullabies, symbols that once encoded knowledge, now worn only as decoration, an empire remembered only as a vague name on fading maps. The 19th century becomes the dawn of the modern world, but perhaps only because it was the dusk of the old. A reset had occurred. The slate was wiped clean. Tartaria was buried, and in its place rose Russia, China, Europe as we know them. The industrial age surged forward, fueled by scarcity, by machines of smoke and steel, while the quiet hum of resonance was forgotten.
Echoes of the reset. And yet, even resets are imperfect. The mud did not bury every window. The fire did not destroy every stone. The ice did not silence every song. Fragments survived, enough to whisper, enough to trouble, enough to awaken curiosity centuries later. The very anomalies we notice today, the buried windows, the impossible architecture, the strange symbols, are the cracks through which memory seeps.
Close your eyes once more. Imagine standing in a ruined city at dawn. The mist clings to walls, half swallowed by earth, domes cracked but still gleaming faintly in the rising sun. You run your hand along the stone, cool, smooth, impossibly precise. Beneath your feet, buried deep, lies another world, waiting to be remembered. The Great Reset was not the end of Tartaria, it was its burial, and what is buried can sometimes be unearthed.
From here, our path turns to what remains in the open, the visible ruins, the lingering anomalies, the monuments that defy explanation, standing as stubborn witnesses to a world erased but not forgotten. Ruins are not dead things. They breathe with absence. They hum with memory. They linger like ghosts in stone. To walk among them is to feel the brush of another world, not entirely gone, not entirely present. If Tartaria was erased, if its name was swallowed in silence, then its ruins are the most stubborn of witnesses. They stand in defiance of the erasure, whispering to any who pause long enough to listen. The hidden floors of cities. In St. Petersburg, tourists marvel at palaces of stucco and marble, facades rising proudly along the Neva. Yet look closely at the base of these buildings, and you will see windows half buried in the street, doorways sealed with stone, staircases that lead downward rather than up. These are explained away as basements, as the quirks of construction on marshy ground, but photographs from the 19th century show something else. Streets dug meters lower than today, entire lower stories revealed, bricked over, forgotten.
The same pattern appears in Moscow, in Kazan, in Novgorod, in cities across Eastern Europe. Even in Paris, Prague, and Vienna, one can find similar anomalies. Windows staring blankly from beneath the earth, arches cut off at ground level. If these were only local accidents, they might be dismissed. But their persistence, their global reach, suggests something deeper. Cities buried not by centuries of dust, but by a single immense upheaval. The towers without purpose.
Across the steppes and into Europe stand towers whose function defies explanation. Some are called bell towers, yet records show no bells. Others are called minarets, though they do not fit the traditions of Islamic design. They rise slender and tall, their proportions exact, their surfaces marked with star-like motifs. Were they once part of a Tartarian network aligned with the stars, tuned to resonate with energy? Or are they merely the remnants of architectural fashions we no longer understand? Close your eyes and imagine standing at the base of such a tower. The wind rushes through its hollow top, producing a low, unearthly hum. The stone vibrates faintly under your touch, as though alive. It feels less like a monument and more like an instrument, a structure built not only to be seen, but to be heard, to be felt.
The orphaned obelisks. In remote regions of Siberia, great stone obelisks rise unexpectedly from the landscape, weathered, cracked, sometimes toppled. They stand in solitude, unclaimed by any known culture. Local legends speak of giants who raised them, of ancestors who worshiped the sun through them. Archaeologists suggest they were boundary markers, but the scale feels excessive, their precision uncanny. Some align with solstices, with equinoxes, with star paths. They seem to be part of a language written not in words, but in light.
Who carved them? Who aligned them? Who needed stones so massive in lands so remote? The silence of history offers no answer, but to those who search for Tartaria, they are signposts, markers of a civilization that measured time not with clocks, but with the turning of the sky, the bridges to nowhere. Another anomaly lies in bridges that seem too grand for the rivers they cross. Massive arches of stone span streams barely large enough to justify a plank. In Russia, in Central Asia, in forgotten corners of Europe, these structures stand out, works of engineering whose purpose no longer matches their context. Were the rivers once greater, their waters swallowed or diverted by catastrophe? Or were these bridges remnants of a different age, a different landscape, inherited and repurposed by later peoples?
To stand upon such a bridge is to feel a kind of dissonance. The craftsmanship is exquisite, the effort immense, and yet the river below is modest, unworthy of such grandeur. Something does not fit, and in that gap, Tartaria whispers, the cities that should not be.
Beyond isolated ruins, there are entire cities whose origins remain mysterious. Kazan, Astrakhan, Tobolsk, each contains structures whose age exceeds their recorded founding. In Tobolsk, for instance, a white Kremlin rises with walls and towers said to be the work of 17th century Russia. Yet within them, details hint at something older, arches buried in soil, stones weathered by more centuries than the records allow. Even further east, in Irkutsk, in Yakutsk, in towns scattered across Siberia, similar patterns appear. Official histories attribute them to Tsarist builders, but how did such immense works arise so suddenly in regions with little infrastructure, few artisans, and harsh climates? Were they truly built in a generation, or were they inherited, their true builders forgotten?
The star forts.
One of the most haunting anomalies tied to Tartaria is the pattern of star forts, massive geometric fortresses shaped like stars with bastions radiating outward in symmetrical perfection. Found across Europe, Asia, and the Americas, these structures appear suddenly in the 16th and 17th centuries, their designs too consistent, too advanced to be coincidences. Official history says they were innovations of Renaissance military science spread by engineers and architects. But why then do they appear in lands far beyond Europe, in Siberia, in remote corners of Asia, where no such engineers are recorded? Were they truly built by modern empires, or were they remnants of Tartaria, a global civilization whose knowledge of geometry and resonance was encoded in stone? Close your eyes and imagine walking the ramparts of such a fort. The walls radiate outward like rays of the sun, the angles precise, the proportions harmonious. From above, it resembles a star, a symbol, a diagram, a geometry of power. Was it only for defense, or did it once serve another purpose aligned with forces we no longer name?
Ruins as witnesses. Ruins unsettle because they do not lie. They stand where they are, they show what they are, regardless of what books claim. They are stubborn, immovable, undeniable, and yet because they do not speak in words, they are easy to reinterpret, to rename, to repurpose. Palaces become museums, temples become churches, fortresses become warehouses. The original meaning is forgotten, and the stones are silenced. But silence is not complete. Walk among these ruins at dusk, and you may feel it, the weight of presence, the sense that these stones remember. The arches frame not only space, but time. The walls hum faintly with the memory of chants, of songs, of voices long gone. The ground beneath your feet holds layers of history, each waiting for rediscovery. The persistence of anomalies.
Why do anomalies matter? Because they resist the neatness of narrative. They refuse to fit the story told in textbooks. A buried window, a tower without purpose, a fort shaped like a star. Each is a small rebellion against silence. Together, they form a chorus, faint but insistent, reminding us that history is more complex than we are told. For those who search for Tartaria, these anomalies are not curiosities, but evidence. They are the surviving ruins of a world erased, fragments of a civilization too vast to vanish entirely. They may not prove Tartaria beyond doubt, but they refuse to let it be forgotten. Toward the modern echo.
As we walk among these ruins, we begin to wonder if Tartaria's stone survived, what else might have endured? Are there echoes of its knowledge in our own technologies, faint inheritances repackaged as modern discoveries? Are there traces in art, in music, in science that hint at a deeper origin? And so our journey moves forward from the silent ruins to the modern world, to the echoes of Tartaria that may still shape our present, disguised as inventions of today, but perhaps older than we imagine. Some say that the past never truly disappears. It lingers like a faint vibration, carried forward in ways we do not immediately recognize. If Tartaria was erased from maps, from chronicles, from classrooms, could it still live on in subtler forms? In our technologies, our art, our architecture, even our collective memory? Perhaps the empire did not vanish entirely, but echoes through the present, disguised as the ordinary hiding in plain sight.
In the geometry of cities, walk the avenues of old European capitals, Paris, Amsterdam, Venice, and you may notice the strange familiarity of their star shaped fortresses, their radiating boulevards, their symmetry aligned to cardinal points. Historians attribute these to Renaissance engineers and Enlightenment planners, yet similar designs appear in cities of the New World, in Quebec, in Savannah, in San Francisco, and further east in Siberian towns that supposedly lacked skilled architects at the time. Star forts and radiating city plans appear again. Could these be survivals of Tartarian design? If its knowledge of geometry and resonance was global, then perhaps later empires simply inherited and repurposed its cities, adding new facades but preserving the ancient layout. To walk such streets today is to walk along the ghost lines of Tartaria, following patterns that once encoded harmony between earth, sky, and stone. In energy and technology,
Modern science tells us that Nikola Tesla dreamed of free energy, towers that could broadcast electricity through the air, currents drawn from the planet itself. His ideas were never fully realized, dismissed as impractical. Yet the domes and spires of old Tartarian architecture bear a striking resemblance to his sketches, tall, resonant, capped with conductive materials, arranged in grids across cities. Did Tesla rediscover something ancient, a knowledge that once pulsed through Tartarian towers? Did his vision echo faintly from a buried memory, a resonance carried across time? Our world is powered by wires, engines, and fuel, but perhaps beneath it there lingers the echo of another way, a world once lit by harmonics and currents we have forgotten. In symbols of nations,
look at the flags, crests, and emblems of modern nations. The double headed eagle still spreads its wings over Russia, Serbia, and Albania. The radiant sun beams on the flags of Kazakhstan, Argentina, Japan. The crescent moon shines for Turkey. And across the Islamic world, wheels, spirals, and stars adorn currencies, government seals, architectural motifs. Were these simply shared human symbols, or did they flow from a deeper source, preserved unconsciously by nations long after Tartaria's name was erased? Perhaps our modern heraldry is less a collection of coincidences than a chorus of echoes, Tartaria's banners still fluttering in disguise. In hidden languages of art, Art often carries memory long after words fade. Folk embroidery across Central Asia, Eastern Europe, and Siberia repeats patterns of suns, stars, crescents, interlocking spirals. These motifs appear in carpets, in jewelry, in painted wooden panels. They are called traditional, decorative, without deeper meaning, yet they are the same shapes carved into Tartarian ruins, the same symbols painted on banners in old travelers' accounts. Even in Western art, echoes remain. Baroque and Renaissance architecture brims with sunbursts, domes crowned with orbs, spires tipped with stars. Were these motifs chosen only for beauty? Or do they carry memory, fragments of an older visual language? Close your eyes and imagine standing before a folk garment embroidered with suns and moons in gold thread. To the wearer, it is simply tradition, but to the attentive eye, it is an echo, a fragment of Tartaria stitched by hands that no longer know its name. In collective memory,
Beyond objects and symbols, there is something subtler still, the persistence of myth. Across cultures, stories endure of a great civilization lost, a golden age erased, a people forgotten, Atlantis in the west, Lemuria in the east, Hyperborea in the north. Tartaria joins this chorus, less as a myth invented, more as a memory half denied.
why does the human imagination return again and again to the idea of lost civilizations? Perhaps because deep down we know something has been erased. The persistence of such stories may itself be an echo, the subconscious refusing to accept the silence imposed by history.
In the architecture of power,
Even modern state buildings carry Tartarian echoes. Government halls built with towering columns, domes that resonate, star motifs on their ceilings. These are called neoclassical, revivals of Roman and Greek ideals. But what if they are not revivals, but survivals? What if they draw not from ancient Rome, but from a tradition passed down from Tartaria, reshaped but never extinguished? Step into a parliament hall or a cathedral built in the last 2 centuries, and you may feel it, the resonance of domes, the hum of proportion, the echo of harmony. Our leaders stand beneath Tartarian echoes, perhaps unaware, perhaps unwilling to acknowledge their true source.
in forgotten corners of the world.
Beyond capitals and museums, Tartaria may echo most strongly in the remote and the ordinary. A well in a small village, carved with symbols no one remembers. A ruined tower in the Siberian forest, its stones still aligned to solstices. A song sung by shepherds that carries syllables older than their language. These are not preserved by states or scholars. They endure because people lived, and in living they carried fragments forward. Close your eyes and imagine walking through a forgotten town on the steppe. Houses sag with age, the wind whistles through empty streets, yet in the square stands a fountain, its stone basin carved with spirals, its water still flowing. No one remembers who built it, but it remains, a small echo, a whisper of Tartaria defying silence. In us, perhaps the greatest echo is not in stone or symbol, but in ourselves. If Tartaria was once real, then its blood flows in millions across Eurasia, its customs folded into new identities, its songs rephrased in new tongues. Even if forgotten, it is carried in bones and breath, in gestures and instincts, in the rhythm of how people move across the steppes.
Memory does not only live in books, it lives in the body, in the way a rider leans into his horse, in the way a singer shapes a note, in the way a child gazes at the horizon and feels the pull of something vast. These are Tartarian echoes, subtle, unrecorded, but alive.
Toward the question of now.
If Tartaria still echoes in our present, in architecture, in symbols, in blood, then perhaps the question is not whether it existed, but why we were made to forget. What is so dangerous about remembering? What power trembles if we acknowledge that the world may be older, stranger, richer than we are told? And so, from the modern echoes, our journey bends toward the shadows of secrecy, to the archives, the vaults of the locked rooms where knowledge of Tartaria may still lie hidden, guarded not by time, but by choice. History is not only what is spoken in classrooms or printed in books, it is also what is locked away, hidden in vaults, preserved yet inaccessible. For every library open to the public, there are chambers where the shelves are closed, where manuscripts gather dust unseen, where maps and chronicles sleep in silence. If Tartaria was truly erased, perhaps its memory has not been destroyed, but stored, carefully, deliberately, in secret archives.
The Vatican's vaults.
Beneath the palaces of the Vatican lies a labyrinth of corridors lined with shelves that stretch for kilometers. Here, behind locked doors, are manuscripts from every corner of the world, collected over centuries, letters of emperors, chronicles of explorers, maps drawn before continents were fully known. Only a fraction has ever been studied.
Whispers tell that among these manuscripts are records of Tartaria, travelogues describing its cities, letters noting its rulers, maps where its name sprawls across Asia, not as fantasy but as fact. Perhaps Jesuit missionaries wrote of encounters in lands beyond Moscow, their letters filed, their words deemed inconvenient. Perhaps papal envoys receiving reports from merchants or diplomats recorded glimpses of a great empire, only to have them hidden when the empire itself was aroused. Imagine walking those corridors at night, the air cool, the silence absolute. You hold a candle, its flame trembling against endless shelves. You pause before a volume bound in leather, its spine unmarked, its pages brittle. Inside, you find a map. The word Tartaria inscribed in ink, faded but unmistakable. No one has looked at it for centuries. The book is closed, replaced upon the shelf, the memory hidden once more.
Imperial archives of Russia.
In St. Petersburg and Moscow, too, archives sprawl, filled with documents gathered during centuries of conquest, reports from generals who marched into Central Asia, sketches of fortresses, accounts of peoples subdued. These archives, too, contain silences, missing years, unexplained gaps, references to cities that no longer exist. Some who have gained rare glimpses speak of documents describing immense fortifications discovered on the steppe, cities with architecture unlike anything in Russia, technologies unfamiliar to the conquerors. Officially, such documents are classified as curiosities or errors, but perhaps they were simply buried, filed under names that would not draw attention, sealed away so that the story of Russia as sole inheritor of the steppes would remain unchallenged. The forbidden shelves of China. In Beijing, deep within the Forbidden City, records of dynasties stretch back millennia. Chronicles detail every eclipse, every rebellion, every embassy received. Yet in these meticulous annals, certain passages are vague, certain lands unnamed, certain encounters with northern powers described only as barbarians or tribes. Could it be that China too once recorded Tartaria, but chose later to erase the name, folding it into a narrative of wilderness rather than empire? Some scholars whisper that in hidden sections of the archives, old maps show borders differently, vast lands not claimed by China or Russia, but marked as separate, sovereign Tartarian. Whether these whispers are true is unknown. The shelves are locked, the documents sealed, the silence unbroken.
Lost libraries.
Beyond the great empires, there are rumors of libraries that no longer exist or exist only in fragments. In Kazan, before its conquest, chronicles spoke of vast collections of manuscripts, burned or carried away. In Central Asia, caravans once transported books as precious as silk or gold. Where are these books now? Were they destroyed in fire and war, or were they taken, hidden in vaults, their knowledge absorbed but not shared? Every time a conqueror raised a city, the smoke of burning libraries rose. But sometimes what is thought destroyed is simply relocated, perhaps in private collections, in basements of museums, in trunks carried to Europe. Some of Tartaria's words still survive, mislabeled, misunderstood, but waiting.
Forbidden maps.
Maps are among the most dangerous artifacts, for they show not only geography but worldview. Old globes, like those made by cartographers in Amsterdam or Venice, clearly mark Tartaria. Later maps erase it. Why? Was it simply error corrected or knowledge suppressed? Whispers tell of maps locked away in universities, maps that show rivers now gone, coastlines altered, cities whose names no longer appear. Some are too accurate for their age, others too strange. To display them would raise questions, and so they remain in drawers consulted only by a few, their existence known but never proclaimed. Imagine opening such a map in the dim light of an archive. Your fingers trace the letters across Asia. Tartaria, not small, not marginal, but bold, vast, undeniable. You feel the weight of silence pressing upon the page. For this map exists, yet the world is told to forget.
The nature of secrecy.
Why are these records hidden? Perhaps to protect fragile paper, perhaps because they are deemed irrelevant, or perhaps because they are inconvenient. For to admit Tartaria existed is to rewrite history, to admit that modern empires built upon ruins, that progress is not linear, that our technologies may not be unique. It would unsettle the story told to justify the present. Secrecy, then, is not always malice. Sometimes it is convenience, sometimes it is fear, but the result is the same: silence. A silence thicker than any mud flood, a silence enforced not by nature, but by choice.
Art whispers of the hidden. Even so, knowledge leaks. Scholars publish footnotes they do not emphasize. Collectors whisper of manuscripts too strange to display. Adventurers claim to have glimpsed shelves where maps bear names now erased. Whether these are fantasies or truths, they form a constellation of rumor that suggests something lies hidden, something guarded.
Close your eyes and imagine standing outside such an archive. The windows are dark, the doors locked. Inside, the shelves wait, the papers slumber. You cannot enter, but you know they are there. You feel the presence of memory pressing outward, restrained but restless. It is as if the past itself wishes to be remembered, even as it is confined toward revelation.
The secret archives are not empty. They hold memory, and memory cannot be contained forever. Sooner or later, doors open, papers surface, fragments emerge. Already in our time, old maps circulate, old books are digitized, anomalies spread beyond the control of silence. The forbidden knowledge of Tartaria, whether in truth or in suggestion, seeps outward once more.
And so, as we leave the locked archives, we step into the present moment where curiosity awakens, where anomalies gather into patterns, where the possibility of revelation grows. Our journey turns now to the final question: what does it mean for us today? If Tartaria truly lived, and if its erasure was the greatest cover up of all time? The final whisper: what if the erasure of Tartaria was the greatest cover up of all time? At the end of our long wandering through ruins and symbols, through archives and silences, one question remains like a shadow that never leaves: what if it is true?
What if Tartaria was not a cartographic mistake, not a collective misunderstanding, not a convenient label for lands unknown, but a real civilization, vast and luminous, erased not by chance but by design? What if the greatest cover up in history is not a secret war or a lost treasure, but the deliberate burial of an empire that might change how we see the world itself? The nature of erasure. To erase is not merely to destroy, it is to replace, to overwrite, to make something invisible by surrounding it with another story. Tartaria may have been covered with mud, its cities half buried, but the greater covering was of words and memory. Russia replaced its lands with Siberia. China folded them into vague frontiers. Europe dismissed them as wilderness. The Vatican withheld its records. Together, the empires created a silence more effective than conquest. Yet silence is never perfect. Buried windows, inexplicable ruins, strange symbols, persistent myths, all these are cracks in the plaster, seams through which the forgotten breathes. What we lost. If Tartaria was real, then what we lost is staggering. We lost a vision of energy drawn not from fire and scarcity, but from harmony and resonance. We lost architecture that was not merely shelter, but song, not merely walls, but instruments tuned to the hum of the earth. We lost knowledge of cycles, of stars, of the balance between sun and moon.
Perhaps we lost more than technology. Perhaps we lost an entire worldview, one in which life was not measured by conquest or accumulation, but by alignment with forces greater than ourselves, a world not driven by engines of smoke, but by currents invisible yet abundant, shared by all like air and light. Why it was erased.
Why erase such a world? Because knowledge is power, and power must be controlled. A civilization that could draw energy freely from nature, that lived in resonance with the earth, would be impossible to dominate. No empire could profit, no ruler could monopolize. To build the modern world of scarcity, of industry, of control, Tartaria had to be forgotten.
And so, whether by catastrophe, seized as opportunity, or by deliberate design, it was buried, its ruins inherited, its symbols repurposed, its name erased. In its place rose the narrative of linear progress, that humanity rose from darkness to light, from ignorance to knowledge, from weakness to strength. A comforting story, but perhaps a false one. The echo in us.
Yet even if erased, Tartaria endures. It endures in stones and ruins, in symbols and songs, in the blood of those who still live on the steppes, and in the cities that once bore its name. It endures in us, in our fascination with lost civilizations, In our hunger for stories of golden ages, in our sense that the world we know is but a shadow of something older, greater, more mysterious.
Why do we dream of Atlantis, of Hyperborea, of Lemuria? Perhaps because deep in our collective memory, we remember Tartaria, not the name, but the feeling that once there was more, once we lived differently, once we walked in resonance with a world that now feels distant.
A mirror for the present.
To ask if Tartaria was erased is to ask about ourselves. What truths are hidden from us now? What silences shape our world, unseen yet powerful? If empires once colluded to bury the past, could they not still collude to shape the present? The cover up of Tartaria, whether myth or memory, is a mirror. It shows us that history is not only about what happened, but about what we are allowed to believe happened. The Whisper of Stone.
Close your eyes. Imagine again standing before a half buried building, its lower windows sealed, its upper domes gleaming faintly in the dusk. The wind sighs through its arches, carrying a sound like breath. You place your hand on the stone, and you feel it hum, faint, steady, alive. In that hum, you hear the whisper, "We were here."
That is Tartaria's final gift, not certainty, but possibility, not a neat story, but a haunting. Its ruins remind us that the world may be older, stranger, richer than we have been told. Its silence invites us to listen, to look again, to question. What if?
And so we return to the question, what if the erasure of Tartaria was the greatest cover up of all time? If so, then history is not a line, but a palimpsest, layers written over layers, some erased, some hidden. If so, then we live not at the peak of progress, but in the aftermath of forgetting. If so, then our world of wires, of fuel, of scarcity is but a fragment, a broken shard of something once more harmonious.
And if so, then perhaps the silence that covers Tartaria is not permanent, for silence is fragile. A whisper, a question, a story told beside a fire is enough to break it, the lullaby of the forgotten.
As night deepens, as the stars spread across the sky like scattered embers, one feels the weight of the forgotten pressing gently, not as a burden, but as a lullaby. Tartaria may be gone, but it sings still in the wind, in the stone, in the blood, in the questions we cannot stop asking.
And perhaps that is enough, for as long as we wonder, Tartaria is not wholly erased. As long as we listen, the cover up is not complete. As long as we whisper its name, it endures, not as empire, but as mystery, as memory, as dream. Close your eyes now. Let the hum of the past carry you. Hear the whisper of stone, the song of wind, the silence that is not silence but presence. Tartaria breathes still, not in books or in maps, but in the spaces between, in the shadows of history, in the longing of the human heart for what has been lost. Sleep then in that whisper, for the story of Tartaria is not finished. It waits, patient, like ruins beneath the earth, to be remembered again.